Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Scene. Tonight we are easing into a story that begins with snow, but not the pleasant kind that looks charming on a postcard and disappears by lunchtime. This is the kind that swallows front doors, buries cars where they stand, presses itself against windows and makes an entire city look less like a place where people live and more like something the weather has decided to keep for itself. We're going to Buffalo, New York in the winter of 1977, and to a storm so severe that people still say its name as though everyone nearby already understands the rest. Now, depending on where you're listening from, snow may be either a delight, an inconvenience, or a personal insult. For some people, snow means a quiet street, a warm drink, and the very convincing promise that nothing productive can possibly be expected today. For others, it means shovels, frozen fingers, and the strange discovery that your car has become a large white guess. Buffalo, of course, was no stranger to snow. Buffalo knew snow in the same way sailors know waves, or cats know how to ignore instructions. It was part of life there. Expected, seasonal, annoying certainly, but familiar. And perhaps that is part of what made the blizzard of 77 so unsettling. It was not a city meeting winter for the first time. It was a winter city meeting something far worse. Before we get into it, take a moment and notice the weather where you are. Is it cold tonight? Is there rain at the window? Is there wind outside doing that thing where it sounds much more dramatic than it actually is? Or maybe it is perfectly still, which somehow makes stories like this feel even stranger. Where are you listening from, and what would it take, in your own street, in your own neighbourhood, for the ordinary outside world to vanish under snow so completely that people could no longer tell where the road ended and the sidewalk began? And if this kind of quiet, slow storytelling is something you enjoy, you already know the gentle little ritual here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and settle in with me. It helps more than you might think. It lets me keep making these calm night journeys into history, science, weather, and all the other corners of the world that are easier to visit when the lights are low and nobody's in a rush. So, let us begin where many difficult stories begin, not with the main event, but with the ordinary confidence people had just before it arrived. On the morning of Friday, January 28th, 1977, Buffalo was already deep in one of the harshest winters it had seen in decades. The months leading into the storm had been unusually cold. Lake Erie had frozen over early, and snow had piled up across the region long before the blizzard itself arrived. January in Buffalo had stayed below freezing for the entire month, something so severe that even in a city used to winter it stood out. By the day the storm struck, there was already deep snow on the ground, and the whole region was primed in the worst possible way for strong wind to turn that snow into a moving wall. That detail matters, because the storm most people remember was not simply a matter of fresh snow falling from the sky in generous amounts, the way movies sometimes depict winter disasters with a certain theatrical innocence. This was a storm built as much from what was already there as from what was still coming. Powdery snow rested over the land and on the frozen surface of Lake Erie, ready to be lifted and driven inland. And once the wind took hold of it, the city was not just dealing with snowfall, it was dealing with snow already waiting everywhere, loose and dry and easy to move, as though the landscape itself had been stocked in advance. It is one of those maddeningly efficient arrangements nature sometimes makes. Freeze the lake, keep the air bitterly cold, let snow sit around in deep drift without a thaw to settle it, then add powerful wind and remove visibility. The ingredients do not look dramatic on a written list, but then neither does flour, butter, heat, until someone places a croissant in front of you. Circumstances as usual matter. People in Buffalo woke that day and went to work. Children went to school, stores opened, traffic moved, planes prepared for takeoff. There had already been bad weather, yes, and winter warnings were not exactly exotic in western New York. But everyday life still does what everyday life usually does. It continues until it cannot. That, more than anything, is the chilling part of many disasters. They do not always begin with panic. Quite often they begin with normal plans, normal errands, normal confidence, and a perfectly ordinary thought along the lines of, "I'll just get this done and head home a little later." Then the front came through. At Buffalo Airport around late morning, conditions changed with stunning speed. The cold front passed, visibility collapsed from 3/4 of a mile to 0, and the wind shifted and strengthened sharply. In a little over 4 hours, the temperature dropped by 26 degrees, falling to 0. By late afternoon, sustained winds at the airport averaged 46 miles per hour, with gusts to 69 miles per hour, while Niagara Falls recorded gusts as high as 75. This was no longer troublesome winter weather. This was the point at which the atmosphere stopped behaving like an inconvenience and started behaving like a demolition crew with no interest in property lines. Try to picture that without smoothing it into a tidy historical image. Picture it not as a famous old storm, but as an actual day becoming unrecognizable in real time. A person standing at a window before noon could still imagine getting through the day. An hour later, that same person might not be able to see beyond the glass at all. Roads that had existed all morning became guesses. Familiar blocks lost their shape. Intersections disappeared into drifting white. Cars stalled or were abandoned. Drivers stepped out and, in some cases, were immediately in conditions so disorienting that direction itself stopped being reliable. This is one of the reasons blizzards are so dangerous in a way that is easy to underestimate. Heavy snow is not only about depth. Wind is what turns bad weather into a trap. It picks snow up and throws it back into the air. It fills in what has just been cleared. It erases landmarks. It makes distance hard to judge. It makes a building that is 30 feet away feel much farther, and it makes people believe they can still make it home when home has already become a much more complicated idea than it was an hour earlier. Within a short time, roads in parts of Buffalo became impassable. Reports from that first day described bumper-high snow by early afternoon, and drifts reaching roughly 15 feet by nightfall in parts of the city. In some areas near Lake Erie, roads became blocked within about half an hour. By midnight, thousands of vehicles were stranded on Buffalo streets, including an estimated 2,000 on Main Street alone, and roughly 8,000 elsewhere in the city. There is something especially eerie about the image of stranded cars in a blizzard, perhaps because a car is normally one of the objects we trust most in bad weather. It is shelter, engine, heater, escape plan, and little metal vote of confidence all at once. You get in, close the door, and assume you're still participating in modern life. But when the snow is this deep, the wind this hard, and the visibility this poor, a car can become a box that is no longer going anywhere. Snow blasts into the engine compartment. Exhaust pipes become blocked. Windows ice up. The heater that once felt reassuring begins to feel conditional. Outside, the world has no interest in whether the vehicle is expensive, sturdy, beloved, or still making payments. At the airport, even aircraft were caught by the speed of the change. 3 airplanes on the tarmac that day were waiting to take off when the blizzard struck. Visibility became so poor that getting them back to the terminal took hours and had to be managed by radio because the pilots could not see the ground crews who would normally guide them. It is difficult to improve upon that as a measure of how quickly the day went wrong. When airplanes cannot find their way across the ground in daylight because the storm has erased the space between one place and another, the world has become very small indeed. And then there was the simple psychological shock of it. Buffalo was a city that understood winter. That phrase matters because people who are unfamiliar with snow often imagine that communities used to harsh winters are somehow immune to being overwhelmed by it. But knowing winter does not make you immune to a blizzard any more than living by the ocean. It makes you immune to a tidal wave. Familiarity can help with preparation. It can help with routines, with equipment, with instinct. What it cannot do is change the scale of what arrives. In fact, familiar conditions can sometimes create a kind of dangerous optimism. People know they have handled storms before. Streets will be ploughed. Temperatures will rise eventually. Someone has seen worse, or claims to have. There is always someone like that. usually wearing a coat that appears to have been bought during the Eisenhower administration. But the blizzard of '77 was not interested in those comparisons. It took a city with winter experience and showed, very quickly, that experience has limits. That first afternoon and evening must have felt stretched and strange, the way crisis hours often do. Time changes its behaviour when ordinary routines break apart. Minutes are spent trying to reach someone by phone. Then half an hour disappears because you are still in the car, still not moving, still hoping the line ahead will shift. People at work wondered whether to leave or stay. People at home watched for family members who should already have arrived. Parents worried about children. Children, depending on age, either sensed that something serious was happening or treated the whole thing as the most dramatic snow day imaginable. Both reactions made sense. Inside homes there would have been that familiar storm time choreography. Curtains pulled aside, radios turned up, boots at the ready. Someone checking a door that was becoming harder to open. Someone else saying it will be fine in a voice that could mean either calm wisdom or active denial. Kitchens become command centres in bad weather, and living rooms become waiting rooms. People boil water, fill containers, gather blankets, keep lights on. Then watch the windows with a concentration usually reserved for exam results or suspicious text messages. Outside, the city was being remade. Snow did not merely pile up. It was sculpted, slammed, compacted, and packed into shapes that resisted ordinary clearing. Meteorologists later noted that the wind broke up the snow crystals and packed them so tightly that the drifts were exceptionally difficult to remove. This was not the loose, fluffy sort of snow that yields with a cheerful sweep of a shovel and a modest complaint. This was dense, hard, wind-driven material that behaved more like stubborn construction than weather. And while all this was happening, the cold added its own severity. The day's temperature plunge was not a side note. Cold changes judgment. It shortens the amount of time a person can safely spend outside. It affects engines, fuel, batteries, exposed skin, and the simple act of walking from one place to another. In a storm like this, cold is not merely background atmosphere, it is part of the machinery. By the next day, the blizzard would be recognised as a major disaster, and President Jimmy Carter would issue an emergency declaration affecting western New York, the first time a snowstorm in the United States received that kind of federal disaster response. But on that opening day, before the full shape of the event was understood, most people were not thinking in terms of national firsts or historical labels. They were thinking in terms of immediate human-sized questions. Can I get home? Is the furnace still running? Where is my husband? Did the kids get picked up? How much food is in the house? Can anyone get through that road? Is Grandma alone right now? These are the true units of a disaster as it is lived, and they arrive long before official language does. There is another reason the blizzard of '77 stayed in memory so powerfully, and it has to do with scale. Storms are often described in numbers, which is useful, but numbers can also be strangely polite. They line up, they behave, they suggest that an event can be managed with enough charts and calm nouns. Yet the human memory of a blizzard is rarely numerical. It is spatial. It is the door you could not open, the bus that stopped and disappeared into white, the car you left behind and found later under a drift, the neighbourhood that sounded different because the snow muted everything and the wind supplied the only voice left. The distance between one house and the next suddenly becoming serious, and Buffalo, on that day, was a city where ordinary distance was failing. Streets were still technically where they had always been, but that detail offered limited comfort. The landscape had been rearranged into barriers, blind corners, and walls of drifted snow. A route that normally took 10 minutes could become impossible. The familiar map in people's minds stopped matching the surface under their feet. That is perhaps the best way to understand the emotional force of the storm. It was not only that Buffalo was buried, it was that Buffalo was interrupted. The basic agreement between people and place had been broken. A person no longer knew that the front step would open, that the car would start, that the road would be visible, that the workplace would remain reachable, that a short walk was short, or that the outside world would continue to make sense in the ordinary way. And the city this happened to was already worn down by the winter that came before it. That part often gets lost when famous storms are remembered only for the single dramatic date attached to them. But weather does not arrive in neat episodes for the people living through it. January 28th did not drop onto an untouched Buffalo. It landed on a city that had already been dealing with relentless cold, steady snowfall, and a winter that seemed determined to keep adding one more unpleasant thing before anyone had fully dealt with the last one. By the time the blizzard came, western New York was not fresh. It was loaded. That is why the wind found so much snow to move, so many weaknesses to expose, and so many people already tired before the true emergency even began. So as we keep moving through this story, it helps to step back just a little from the whiteout itself and look at the days and weeks leading up to it. Because the storm did not appear out of nowhere in the emotional sense, even if its worst moments arrived with shocking speed. The city had been holding its breath long before the sky finally closed in, and once you see what that winter had already been doing to Buffalo, the rest of the blizzard starts to make a grim kind of sense. To understand why the blizzard hit Buffalo the way it did, it helps to spend a little more time with the winter that came before it, because the famous day in the late January did not arrive over a clean city with a light dusting on the rooftops and a few polite flakes in the air. It arrived over a place that had already been worked over, worn down, frozen solid, and packed with snow to the point where one more serious storm was not just one more storm. It was the thing that pushed everything past ordinary winter trouble and into something much harsher. Buffalo, of course, was used to snow. That was not new. Snow in Buffalo is not some rare guest that appears once every few years and makes everyone rush to the window with the excitement of a Victorian child. It is part of the arrangement. It belongs to the place. Streets are ploughed, boots are owned, and people generally develop a practical relationship with frozen precipitation. They know how to drive in it, complain about it, underestimate it, and go buy milk in it even when logic suggests staying home. But the winter of 1976 to 1977 was not operating within the usual limits. By the time January reached its last week, Buffalo had already been hit again and again, and the city was carrying the weight of all that weather in very literal ways. On roads, on roofs, around parked cars, at curbs, in alleyways, and in the slow daily work of trying to clear enough space to keep normal life moving. The numbers alone give you a sense of how relentless it had become. Buffalo recorded 60.7 inches of snow in December 1976, and then 68.3 inches in January 1977. That January total is listed by the National Weather Service as the snowiest January on record for Buffalo, and the season as a whole finished with 199.4 inches, still among the city's snowiest winters ever measured. The month was not just snowy, it was cold in a way that made all that snow stay put. Buffalo's average temperature for January 1977 was 13.8 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest January on record there. That cold matters because snow behaves differently when the air stays bitter and the ground never gets a chance to soften. In an ordinary winter, or at least in a kinder one, there are little pauses. A slightly warmer day, a bit of melting at the curb, a grimy afternoon when the edges of the piles sink a little and the city exhales. Buffalo did not get much of that relief. Snow that fell in late December had company almost immediately. Then more arrived. Then more. Roads narrowed, ploughed banks hardened. Parking became a kind of negotiation between physics and hope. Front steps had to be cleared again. Sidewalks had to be found again. The whole city began that slow, weary process of winter accumulation, where each new snowfall is not only itself but also a layer added to every unfinished chore from the storm before. There had already been serious snow and blowing snow events earlier in the month, On January 10th, 1977, Buffalo Airport recorded 13.2 inches of snow, with over a foot reported across western New York. Wind gusts reached 59 miles per hour, visibility dropped to 0 in whiteouts, and by the morning of January 11th there were already 27 inches of snow on the ground. That was more than 2 weeks before the blizzard that would become famous, which means people were not meeting the end of January fresh. They were already shoveling from deep reserves of patience, and probably from deep reserves of lower back pain as well. And this is where the story becomes less about one dramatic weather event, and more about a city being slowly prepared for trouble by a series of smaller but still punishing conditions. The roads do not become dangerous all at once. A place becomes vulnerable in stages. First, repeated snow leaves less room to move it, then cold keeps it from settling or melting usefully. Then wind starts to turn every open area into a place where drifts rebuild faster than crews can clear them. Then people keep doing what they always do, because work still begins in the morning and schools still open and groceries still need buying, and all of that makes sense until the weather decides it no longer will. Another major part of the setup sat just to the west of the city, broad and cold and usually associated with lake-effect snow in a more familiar form. Lake Erie had frozen early that winter, and by January 26, 1977, it was almost completely ice-covered. The frozen lake was also blanketed with snow. That meant the region was not just surrounded by snow on land. It had an enormous supply of loose, dry snow spread across the lake surface as well. Once strong winds arrived, all of that could be picked up and driven inland. This is one of the reasons the blizzard of 77 became so severe, even though the amount of fresh snow falling from the sky during the event itself was not, by Buffalo standards, the only remarkable thing. The region already had snow lying everywhere, and the wind had more than enough material to work with. That frozen lake changes the whole mood of the story, because it means the storm was waiting in pieces before it arrived in full. The ingredients were already in place. Snow sat on the ground in the city. Snow sat over the frozen lake. Roads were narrowed. Space for ploughing had shrunk. Temperatures stayed brutally low. There is a particular kind of tension in that sort of setup, though most people living through it would not describe it that way in the moment. They would describe it more practically. The street has not been fully cleared. The corner is hard to turn. Parking is a mess. The drifts by the side door are back. The car does not like this cold. The furnace is running constantly. The boots are still wet from yesterday. It is winter in the ordinary spoken language of a household, but the background conditions are quietly becoming dangerous. By late January, Buffalo had been under nearly continuous snow cover since the end of November. Prior to January 28th, it had snowed on most days since just after Christmas, and by the time the blizzard began, more than 30 inches of snow were already on the ground at the airport, with one National Weather Service summary noting about 37 inches of snowpack and older drifts in place before the main event intensified. The city streets were already so clogged that the National Guard had been called in, even before anyone knew the coming storm would turn into the blizzard of 77. That is an extraordinary detail, and one worth lingering over. The emergency response was already beginning before the famous emergency had even fully announced itself. It is difficult to overstate how important that is to understanding the days just before the whiteout. Popular memory often treats disasters as if they step onto a stage all at once, nicely labelled, with dramatic music and perhaps a title card helpfully floating in the air. Real life is much less considerate. It is layered. By the time a storm becomes famous, many of the hardest practical problems are already in motion. City workers are tired. Equipment has been used hard. Snow has already been moved once, twice, 3 times. Residents have already changed plans, made repairs, adjusted routines, and developed that slightly brittle winter humour that says, well, at least it cannot get much worse, which is the kind of sentence weather hears as a personal challenge. Picture Buffalo in those last days before January 28th. Streets lined with high banks of old snow, no longer soft or pretty but grey at the edges and packed hard. Intersections tighter than they should be. Side streets narrowed into channels, cars parked wherever they can fit, their shapes altered by frozen build-up around the tyres, steps and porches needing regular clearing just to stay usable, children climbing on snowbanks that looked, to them, like a recreational improvement to the neighbourhood, adults looking at those same snowbanks and seeing one more thing to shovel when the plough came through and pushed a fresh ridge across the driveway. Daily life was still functioning, yes, but it was functioning under strain. The cold made everything slower and more stubborn. Engines protested, batteries failed, door locks stiffened. Metal hurt your hand if you touched it carelessly. People who had to work outside did so with scarves up and heads down, concentrating on the next immediate task instead of entertaining any romantic ideas about winter beauty. At home, heat became something you noticed not because it was luxurious, but because without it the entire day would become a project of survival. A kitchen with something simmering on the stove was not quaint. It was sensible. A hallway full of boots and coats was not clutter. It was evidence of a season that had become labour. And yet, because this was Buffalo, much of it still would have felt manageable right up until the point it no longer was. That is what familiarity does. A city develops confidence, even when the conditions are ugly. Snowfall records can sound dramatic in hindsight, but on the ground they are experienced as 1,000 smaller routines. Somebody leaves for work earlier, somebody keeps a shovel in the trunk, somebody calls ahead before driving, somebody says the roads are not great but passable, somebody else says they have seen worse, and maybe they have, or maybe they simply enjoy saying it. Winter cities often continue by habit. They know hardship, and knowledge can look very much like calm, even when the situation underneath is becoming unstable. The weather in January 1977 across the broader eastern United States was severe well beyond Buffalo. The month is remembered as part of a major cold wave, and many places across the east dealt with unusually persistent cold and repeated winter storms. In Buffalo, that larger pattern translated into conditions that kept reinforcing themselves. Snow fell, temperatures stayed low, the lake froze, more snow accumulated. What could have been a rough winter became, little by little, the exact setup a violent windstorm would need. There is also something especially difficult about living through a winter where the trouble does not come in one dramatic burst and then leave, but instead hangs around and keeps adding administrative tasks to your life. One storm means shoveling. Several storms mean shoveling, moving the car, finding the car, digging around the furnace vent, watching the roof line, checking on older relatives, planning errands more carefully, keeping more food in the house, and having the same conversation about the driveway often enough that it becomes part of your personality. By late January, Buffalo had been having that conversation for a while. The city itself was under pressure in other ways too. Buffalo in the late 1970s was not exactly floating on effortless prosperity. Like many industrial cities in the region, it was dealing with economic strain and the long, uneasy shift that hit manufacturing centres in those years. A hard winter lands differently on a city already carrying stress. Municipal services are stretched, households are stretched, jobs still have to be reached, heating bills still arrive. A blizzard does not choose a convenient moment, and bad weather rarely cares whether the people beneath it are already having a difficult year. I mention this not to widen the story too far, but because the mood of a place matters. A city can be tired before the storm officially begins. Still, daily life kept moving. That is one of the strangest and most familiar things about the run-up to nearly every disaster. People continue inside their routines because routines are how life is lived. Teachers teach, shopkeepers open, parents bundle children into coats, delivery drivers squint through snow glare, office workers arrive stamping their boots. Someone brushes off the front step for the third time that week. Someone else says January has felt about 6 months long, which in fairness it probably had. Even in a winter like this one, there are groceries to buy, lunches to pack, buses to catch, and ordinary little concerns that do not stop simply because the city is slowly being loaded with snow, like a shelf receiving too many books. By the morning of January 28th, new snow had begun falling around 5 in the morning. About 2 inches of fresh powder accumulated on top of an already deep snowpack, and older drifts left by earlier storms dating back to Christmas. Winds were strengthening ahead of a sharp, cold front. The city was already in poor shape for handling any added strain. Streets were narrowed, snow was deep, and the combination of fresh powder with the old snow already sitting on land and lake meant that once the wind truly arrived, Buffalo would not just be dealing with the weather of that one day. It would be dealing with the stored weather of the entire season. That phrase, stored weather, is about as close as one can get to the practical truth of it. The blizzard was not only something that happened in the sky, it happened on the roads that had been narrowed for weeks, on top of snowbanks built by earlier storms, across neighbourhoods already boxed in by old drifts, and over a frozen lake carrying its own wide reserve of wind-blown snow. A lot of winters give you a hard day. This winter gave Buffalo a hard month, and then used all of it at once. And so the city entered that Friday morning already braced in ways it may not have fully realised. People stepped into a day that looked like more winter, which was true, just not true enough. They saw snow, and Buffalo knew snow. They saw cold, and Buffalo knew cold. They saw streets that were difficult, and those had been difficult for some time. Nothing in the first glance necessarily explained what was waiting in the next several hours. That is how it often works. Catastrophe frequently wears the face of continuation right up until the moment it shows its real scale. It is worth pausing on that, because it gives the blizzard its particular force. The storm did not strike a city that was relaxed and open and ready to absorb inconvenience. It struck a city already hemmed in by old snow, dulled by cold and operating with less room than usual for error. The people of Buffalo were not ignoring winter, they were already dealing with it every day, and that may be the most unsettling part of all. This was not a case of inexperience. It was a case of conditions becoming so stacked, so efficient in their cruelty, that the usual local knowledge and stubbornness were no longer enough. By late morning, the front would pass the airport. Temperatures would tumble, visibility would collapse, wind would stop being an annoyance and start acting like a machine built to move snow into every possible place it should not be. The city, already half buried in the work of the season, was about to find out what happened when all that waiting winter finally stood up and started moving. By the time Friday morning reached late morning, Buffalo was already set up for trouble in the most practical sense. Snow had started around 5 in the morning, and about 2 inches of fresh powder had fallen on top of a snowpack that was already roughly 37 inches deep, with older drifts left from storms going back to Christmas. Streets were clogged before the main event arrived. The National Guard had already been called in to help with snow conditions in the city, even before anyone could see what the next several hours were about to become. That is the important thing to keep in mind as the day turns. The blizzard did not sweep into a clean, open Buffalo, where roads were wide, curbs were visible, and all that was needed was a bit of extra caution and a decent pair of gloves. It arrived over a city that was already narrowed, stacked, delayed, and carrying a winter's worth of snow in every direction. So when the wind finally took over, it was not working from scratch. It had materials. It had loose powder on the streets, loose powder on open ground, and a frozen Lake Erie covered with dry snow that could be picked up and driven inland. That is why the storm came to be remembered less as a simple snowfall, and more as something the wind built out of what was already there. At the Buffalo airport, the temperature had actually risen during the morning, climbing from 5 degrees Fahrenheit at midnight to 26 degrees by 11 a.m. Ahead of the sharp Arctic front, winds were freshening from the south, and to many people this probably felt like just one more unsettled winter day in a season full of them. Then, at 11:35 a.m, the front passed the airport. In a short time, visibility dropped from 3/4 of a mile to 0. The wind shifted and strengthened from a modest southerly breeze to southwest winds at 29 miles per hour, gusting to 49. Over the next little more than 4 hours, the temperature fell 26 degrees, reaching 0. By late afternoon, sustained winds at the airport averaged 46 miles per hour, with gusts to 69, while Niagara Falls recorded gusts as high as 75. It is one thing to read those numbers calmly, indoors, many years later, with a drink nearby and no immediate need to find your car. It is another thing entirely to imagine being in Buffalo as that change took place in real time. The day did not politely worsen, it snapped. One moment there was still some usable shape to the city. A little later, the air itself had become the problem. Visibility did not become poor in a gradual, negotiable way. It went to zero. That matters, because zero visibility is not dramatic language. It means you cannot reliably see where you're going, what is ahead, whether the road continues the way you think it does, or whether the building you're trying to reach is still where your mind insists it must be. Wind in an ordinary snowstorm is irritating. Wind in a blizzard like this is architecture. It takes loose snow and gives it form. It turns open spaces into barriers, corners into traps, and streets into places that stop functioning as streets. It fills in what has just been cleared. It takes a familiar route and makes it behave like a maze. The reason this section has the title it does is simple. During the blizzard of 77, the wind did not merely push snow around. It made structures out of it. Drifts rose well above cars, blocked doors, swallowed intersections, and in some places reached 15 to 25 feet or more in the Buffalo area, with even higher drifts reported in a few locations. That kind of drift changes the meaning of everything around it. A front porch is no longer a front porch if the door opens into packed snow. A sidewalk is no longer a sidewalk if it is buried under a wind-built ridge taller than a person. A road is no longer a road if it has become an uneven white surface with abandoned cars hidden somewhere underneath. This is one of the reasons people who lived through the storm remember not just the snowfall, but the shapes it created. The city was not simply coated, it was rearranged. And because the snow was being driven and packed so violently, those shapes were stubborn. Meteorologist Ben Kolker later explained that the wind broke up the snow crystals and packed them so tightly that they became almost like cement. In some places, clearing equipment had to attack the drifts more like hard material than like loose snow. There is something deeply unsettling about snow becoming harder than your assumptions. We think of snow as soft, decorative, perhaps annoying if there is too much of it, but still fundamentally fluffy in the way a winter postcard suggests. This storm had very little interest in postcard behaviour. Snow packed by those winds could hold shape, resist clearing, and shut things with real force. In at least one Buffalo suburb, volunteer firefighters reportedly used a trenching machine to get people out of a house that had drifted shut. Earth-moving equipment, not normal ploughs, became necessary in many places because the drifts were simply too high and too dense. And while the snow was being packed into walls, the city itself was losing the ordinary signals that make movement possible. Roads disappeared first in the practical sense. That is, drivers could no longer tell where lanes were, where curbs were, or whether the stretch ahead was clear. Then they disappeared psychologically. Once enough vehicles stalled or were abandoned, the whole idea of driving through the city began to collapse. By midnight Friday, officials estimated that about 2,000 cars were stranded on Main Street alone, with roughly 8,000 more stranded on other streets in Buffalo. Those were not tidy rows of parked vehicles. They were obstacles, shelters, hazards, and markers of the exact moment when ordinary travel ceased to be ordinary. One of the eeriest details from that day comes from the airport. 3 airplanes on the tarmac were waiting to take off when the blizzard hit. One plane idled for several minutes in the storm, and its nosewheel froze, preventing it from turning properly. It took hours to bring the aircraft back to the terminal, and the only way to manage it was by radio, because the pilots could not see the ground crews who would normally guide them. There is no need to add dramatic embellishment to that. A storm severe enough to make large aircraft effectively blind and awkward while still on the ground has already made its point. What happened on the roads was just as disorienting, only more personal. A driver heading home might have believed for several minutes at least that waiting it out in the car was sensible. That is often the first instinct. Stay inside, keep the heat going, let the worst pass. But blizzard logic is cruel. Snow builds around the vehicle, exhaust can be blocked, drifts harden, visibility stays gone. If you leave the car, you risk losing direction in conditions where even a short distance can become confusing. If you stay, you are pinned in a box that the storm is slowly hiding. The Buffalo blizzard trapped thousands of people in exactly that kind of problem, and it did so fast enough that many never really had a proper chance to revise their plans. People inside buildings were not in some comfortable position of detached observation either. They could hear the wind, watch windows disappear into driven snow, and feel the outside world losing its shape. By Friday evening, authorities estimated that about 13,000 people were stranded in downtown Buffalo, with many more stuck in surrounding communities and industrial plants. Hundreds sheltered in government buildings and public venues simply because they could not get home. The city had entered that strange disaster phase where normal categories stop working. Workers became overnight guests in office buildings. Commuters became emergency shelter residents. Public buildings became dormitories by accident. And this is where the wind truly starts to feel like the central character, because it was not satisfied with reducing visibility and stacking drifts. It kept rebuilding the problem. A plough could open a path, and the wind would begin laying fresh snow back across it. A route might seem possible for a short time, then close again. When the storm eased a little on Saturday morning, crews went back out, but abandoned vehicles made their work much harder, and later renewed winds caused more drifting. On Sunday, a partial clearing lured sightseers and extra drivers back onto roads that were still unstable, and when the winds increased again in the afternoon, hundreds more people became stranded, and their abandoned cars blocked routes that had only just been reopened. The storm had a nasty talent for taking any small progress personally. That pattern, the repeated rebuilding of drifts, is one reason the blizzard of '77 stayed in memory as something more than a single bad afternoon. It was not merely that the wind hit hard once. It kept turning any open space back into work. Streets that had been made usable were made unusable again. The low-pressure system associated with the front stalled and looped in a way that prolonged the event, keeping western New York in the storm from January 28th into February 1st. So even when people were tempted to think the worst had passed, the weather had not fully finished. There is also the simple bodily side of all this, which should never be overlooked in stories about weather. Winds of this strength, combined with those temperatures, produced wind chills that were reported around -50 to -60 degrees Fahrenheit by the older calculation then in use. You did not need to be lost for very long in that kind of cold to be in serious danger. A short walk became risky. Digging out became exhausting faster than usual. A person working outside could not rely on determination alone. The storm was not merely inconvenient or disorienting. It was physically punishing in a very direct way. If you imagine the city from above, what you see is not just snow, but interruption. Broad streets become narrow white trenches, cars become irregular bumps, intersections vanish. Along the waterfront and open areas exposed to the lake, the wind has more room to gather force and more snow to move. It keeps taking what the winter has stored and delivering it into the city in fresh configurations. The phrase ground blizzard is often used for storms like this, and it fits here because so much of the danger came from snow, already on the ground being lifted, blasted and redeposited. Much of the snow moved during the blizzard was not newly born in the clouds above Buffalo at all. It had been sitting there waiting, on land and on the frozen surface of Lake Erie, until the wind arrived to put it to work. That helps explain why the storm could seem almost alive in its ability to erase and rebuild. New snow certainly fell, but the existing snowpack was just as important. During the blizzard, about a foot of new snow was associated with the event in Buffalo, but much of what buried the city was snow that had already accumulated earlier and was then blown into drifts by those fierce winds. So residents were not simply watching the sky. They were living inside a city where the ground itself had become mobile. That is a very different experience from a heavy but ordinary snowfall. It means the storm can keep taking from one place and adding to another without pause. The stories people tell after events like this often come back to scale in an oddly domestic way. Someone remembers opening a door and finding a wall. Someone remembers looking for a car that had become a white lump. Someone remembers a path dug from house to street that disappeared again. Those are not small memories. They are how the disaster enters ordinary life. The wind made large public problems, yes, but it also made hundreds of private ones. It decided whether a family could open the back door, whether an elderly neighbour could be reached, whether a furnace vent stayed clear, whether groceries remained accessible, whether medicine could get through, whether the short distance to the next house was still simple. By Friday evening, the police were close to immobile on many city streets. Through radio and television, Buffalo authorities asked residents to loan snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles to help emergency response. That single detail says a great deal about what the wind had accomplished. It had taken a modern city with roads, traffic systems, patrol cars, buses, and all the normal assumptions of urban movement, and forced it to fall back on whatever could still crawl across the buried surface. Snowmobiles were not a novelty here. They were becoming a necessity. Even then, the drifts could create dangers that were hard to predict. In some places across western New York, emergency snowmobile use was later restricted because the snow had piled so high that riders were coming dangerously close to power lines and roofs. In one town, drifts of around 30 feet were reported severe enough to create power line hazards even for emergency traffic. That is what wind-built walls do. They do not merely block travel, they alter vertical distance. They make rooftops seem closer to the ground and turn ordinary utility lines into unexpected threats. Snow, by then, was not lying politely beneath the city. It was changing the city's dimensions. There is a dry sort of humour hiding in that. The kind weather disasters always seem to produce later, because no one expects winter to become a problem in 3 dimensions. People prepare for slippery roads, cold starts, and frozen locks. They do not usually expect the snowpack to rise high enough that a snowmobile might have an argument with a chimney. But that is exactly what violent drifting can do. It can turn flat neighbourhoods into uneven terrain and make familiar places look as though someone has tried to rebuild them out of hard white rubble. And still the wind kept going. Late afternoon on January 28th was the worst period in Buffalo, with average winds around 46 miles per hour and gusts up to 69 at the airport, and stronger gusts at Niagara Falls. Visibility had already collapsed, temperatures had already plunged, and the packed snow was already building into forms ordinary ploughs could not manage. By then, the city was not simply being snowed on, it was being dismantled and reassembled by force into something less mobile, less visible, and much more dangerous. What makes this part of the story so unnerving is that the process was mechanical. The wind did not rage in some theatrical way that gave people a clear, dramatic warning, and then kindly paused for them to rearrange their lives. It just kept doing what powerful wind over deep powder does: lift, drive, deposit, pack, repeat. The result was a city of drifts, a city of blocked doors and hidden cars, a city where empty space could not be trusted because it might not be empty at all. Buffalo had known snow for generations. What it met on that day was something more efficient. It was a storm that knew how to use the city's own winter against it, and once that happened, people were left to deal with the next, much harder problem, which was not simply that snow had fallen, but that the city itself had begun to disappear underneath it. By the time Buffalo reached the late afternoon of Friday, January 28th, the city was no longer functioning as a city in the ordinary sense. It still had streets, of course. It still had intersections, storefronts, traffic lights, front porches, bus routes, office buildings, schools, churches, loading docks, and all the other dependable pieces of urban life. But those things had begun to slip out of practical use. The roads were there in the legal sense, in the map sense, in the memory sense. What they were no longer for many people was visible. The storm had crossed that line where familiar places still existed but could no longer be used as they were meant to be used. That is one of the strangest qualities of a blizzard. It does not destroy a city in the same way a fire might, or a flood, or an earthquake. It leaves much of the structure standing. Houses remain houses, buildings remain buildings, street names remain on paper, yet daily life still collapses because the spaces between those things stop working. The route from office to home fails, the walk from curb to front door fails, the short drive to the store fails. A city is not only buildings, it is the ability to move between them. When the blizzard of '77 reached its worst, Buffalo lost much of that ability in a matter of hours. At the airport, visibility dropped to zero around midday as the Arctic front passed, and strong winds began driving snow so hard that by late afternoon the average wind speed was 46 miles per hour, with gusts to 69. Those conditions built and rebuilt drifts across roads and intersections throughout the city. The visual effect of that must have been deeply disorienting. A person looking out from a second-floor window would not have seen a neat layer of snow gradually becoming deeper in a way that could be reasonably measured and then discussed over dinner. What they would have seen was movement. Snow did not simply fall and stay put. It flew sideways, climbed, piled, twisted, packed, and erased. Corners vanished first because corners always seemed to suffer in bad weather. Then parked cars stopped looking like cars. Then the distinction between road and sidewalk gave up entirely. Snowbanks that had already been high from earlier storms were lifted, added to, and reshaped. Open streets turned into long white channels, and then in many places even those channels disappeared. A buried car has a peculiar sadness to it. Houses at least look as though they belong in snow. Trees can carry it with dignity. Even lampposts seem to tolerate it with a sort of municipal resignation. Cars, by contrast, look surprised. They are built for movement, for deadlines, for errands, for the quiet confidence of getting from one place to another without needing to think too hard about the space in between. When they are swallowed by a blizzard, they lose that identity almost immediately. First the tyres disappear, then the wheel wells, then the doors look smaller, then the windshield is gone behind drifted snow, and what remains is not really a car in the useful sense, but a shape, a white mound with a mirror sticking out of it if you're lucky, and perhaps not even that if the wind is feeling thorough. By midnight on that first day, officials estimated that about 2,000 cars were stranded on Main Street alone, and roughly 8,000 more were stranded on other streets in the city of Buffalo. That is an astonishing number, and it helps explain why the cleanup became such a nightmare almost immediately. Plows could not simply clear roads. They had to deal with thousands of stalled or abandoned vehicles embedded in the very snow they were trying to move. By Saturday morning, as visibility improved a little, Buffalo sent plows back out, but those cars made the work far more difficult. By 6 in the morning, the city's Commissioner of Street Sanitation already had 30 private tow trucks removing vehicles, and later that day the number rose to 50. Try to picture Main Street not as the familiar idea of a major city street, but as a frozen corridor of stopped intentions, cars that had been heading home, cars that had been heading to work, cars that had perhaps only meant to go a few blocks farther, delivery trucks, family sedans, work vans, maybe a bus or two, each one representing a decision made while the day still seemed negotiable. I can make it. The road looks bad, but manageable. I should leave now before it gets worse. Only need another 10 minutes. Those are the sorts of thoughts that fill disaster scenes long before anyone uses the word disaster. Then the weather closes in. The car slows, the line ahead stops moving, and modern life begins to reveal how much of it rests on the simple assumption that the road will continue to exist in usable form. In Buffalo that afternoon, that assumption expired quickly. As the whiteout deepened, People on the roads would have lost the cues they normally depended on without noticing, at first, how serious that loss had become. The centre line was gone. The curb was gone. The parked cars that normally marked the edge of a lane became soft-edged lumps, if they were visible at all. Traffic signals might still be there overhead, but seeing the light changes did very little good if no one could move. The road surface itself blended into the shoulder, and the shoulder blended into snowbanks that had been there for weeks. Under those conditions, a city stops being legible. You are no longer reading streets, you are reading guesses, and once a few vehicles stop in a blizzard, many more stop behind them. That is one reason these storms produce such eerie urban stillness. Motion is lost in clusters. A single stuck car becomes several stuck cars. A slow line becomes a stopped line. A stopped line becomes an obstruction to ploughs. Then the obstruction becomes part of the snowbound landscape, and after a little while it is hard to remember that the white ridge in front of you was once a row of moving traffic. In Buffalo, that process played out across major streets and neighbourhood roads alike, and within a very short time some routes became less like transportation corridors and more like storage areas for vehicles the storm had decided to keep. There is a practical cruelty to that. When a person abandons a car in a blizzard, they are often doing so because staying in it has become too dangerous, too cold, too uncertain, or because they have been told they must leave it and seek shelter. But once enough people do that, the city inherits thousands of obstacles in exactly the places where access matters most. Emergency crews cannot get through. Ploughs cannot pass easily. Supply deliveries slow. Streets that might have been reopened become blocked again, not because snow alone is in the way, but because every buried vehicle has become a piece of inconvenient urban sculpture. The storm also changed how distance felt on foot. A car that looked close might require climbing through drifts to reach. A storefront that should have been visible from the corner might not be visible at all. A person leaving a vehicle and trying to walk to a nearby building could find that nearby had become a much less useful word. In whiteout conditions, people lose orientation with alarming speed, especially in a city where every surface is reflecting snow and the normal visual boundaries have vanished. What seems to be a straight line can drift sideways. What appears to be the edge of a sidewalk can actually be the top of a drift. A short walk can become much harder, simply because the body must push through snow that is deeper, denser, and more irregular than expected. And then there is the sound, or rather the way sound behaves in a buried city. Wind dominates first. It gets into door frames, around corners, under eaves, through the narrow places where older houses always seem to keep a little weather in reserve. Engines that are still running sound strained, less confident than usual, as though they too are beginning to understand the situation. But everything else grows oddly quiet. Fewer tyres, fewer voices, fewer ordinary street noises. That is one of the eerie things people often remember after major snowstorms. A city becomes both loud and muffled at once. The wind never shuts up, and yet the normal life underneath it seems to have been tucked away somewhere out of reach. Inside stranded vehicles, time would have behaved badly. Minutes stretch when you cannot tell whether the line of traffic ahead is moving. The heater may still be running, which offers some comfort, but the comfort feels fragile. You look in the mirrors and see less and less. Snow keeps building around the doors. Someone in the car says to wait a little longer. Someone else says maybe it is time to try for that building over there, though no one is entirely sure how far over there actually is. Every practical choice becomes harder because the storm is changing faster than judgment can keep up with it. The car, which had been a plan, becomes a question. Many people in Buffalo ended up sheltering wherever they could. By Friday evening, around 13,000 people were stranded in downtown Buffalo, with many taking refuge in public buildings, government offices and other improvised shelters, because getting home was no longer possible. Others were stranded at workplaces and factories, in cars, or in neighbourhoods cut off by drifts. The city had entered that state where a person's location at the start of the afternoon could determine where they would spend the night. not because of preference or scheduling, but because the roads had effectively ceased to cooperate. A city full of stranded cars is also a city full of stranded plans. Somewhere, someone had left the house assuming they would be back in time for dinner. Somewhere else, a child was waiting for a parent whose car was now buried in a line of frozen traffic. Somebody had likely intended to stop for bread or milk or cat food, because people always need something inconveniently ordinary right before history decides to happen. Somebody else had been halfway through a work shift and suddenly realised that the building itself had become the only sensible place to remain. These are the unseen scenes inside a blizzard. Weather reports tell you about wind speed and visibility. They do not tell you how many casseroles sat untouched on stoves because no one got home, or how many dogs sat by doors listening for cars that would not arrive that night. By Saturday morning, even as the weather eased slightly, the city did not simply pop back into life. Roads had to be reclaimed one lane at a time, and even that modest goal was complicated by all the abandoned vehicles. Some major roads could be opened in partial form as ploughs and state transportation equipment worked through the city, but progress stayed fragile. On Sunday morning, as the wind and snow let up somewhat and even the sun appeared at times, several major roads, including Maine, Broadway, Michigan, Sycamore, Walden, Fillmore, Ohio, and much of South Park and Delaware were reopened to a limited extent. Then, later that afternoon, the wind increased again, visibility dropped once more, and hundreds of additional people became stranded while newly abandoned cars blocked routes that had only just been cleared. That sequence is worth lingering over because it captures the maddening character of the storm. Recovery kept starting too early. The city would gain a little ground, see a bit of sun, reclaim a few roads, and then find the weather building the same problem all over again. A cleared lane is not much use if a fresh line of stranded cars appears in it 3 hours later. A plough pass does not feel like victory if the wind begins laying snow back across the street before the driver has reached the next intersection. This is why storms like this become emotionally exhausting as well as physically dangerous. They keep undoing reassurance. Every sign of improvement arrives with fine print. There is also something grimly funny, in the driest possible way, about how quickly cars lose their identity once snow gets serious enough. People tend to know their own cars very well. The colour, the little dent near the rear light, the bumper sticker they no longer fully agree with, the way the passenger door sticks in deep cold, the radio preset that is always too loud when the engine starts. But after a blizzard like this, many of those details disappear beneath a uniform white coating. A whole row of vehicles begins to look like a set of failed guesses. Somewhere under that drift is a green sedan. Somewhere under that one is a delivery truck. Somewhere under the one near the hydrant is a station wagon that left for work at 11 and never quite made it past early afternoon. It becomes a neighbourhood archaeology project, only much colder and with worse footwear. And the problem did not stop at the curb. Residential streets, driveways, porches and side entrances were affected by the same relentless drifting. A car parked safely at home could still be trapped beyond use because the street in front of it had become an impassable ridge. A garage door could be blocked. Front steps could vanish. Doors could become hard to open or impossible. The storm did not care whether a vehicle was moving or parked. It simply used whatever shape was available and buried it into the new landscape. Houses kept their addresses, but the path from those addresses to the outside world could disappear completely. This is where the city starts to feel less like a transportation network and more like a set of isolated islands. One household may be safe and warm, but cut off. Another may have power, but no way to reach relatives. Another may be staring at the place where the street should be, and realizing there is now only a white mass, uneven and hard-packed, with no obvious route through it. The roads between people in every sense had become unreliable, and when that happens in a storm, fear changes shape. It is no longer only about the weather itself. It becomes about who can be reached, who cannot, who is stuck in a car, who is still at work, who has enough food, who has enough heat, who is alone, and who is already trying to make their way through the city despite every sign that the city does not want to be crossed. The official toll from the blizzard in western New York and southern Ontario eventually reached at least 29 deaths, and many victims were found in or near vehicles. The National Weather Service specifically notes that many were found frozen in half-buried cars during the 4-day ordeal. That detail hangs over every image of those stranded streets. A buried car is not only a striking visual, in the worst cases it is the final small shelter. A person trusted against weather that turned out to be far stronger than it looked from the driver's seat. It would be tempting, from a comfortable distance, to imagine that once the roads became obviously impossible, everyone simply stopped trying to move. But life is not that tidy, and storms rarely allow clean transitions from ordinary behaviour to emergency behaviour. Some people still needed to get somewhere. Some were already committed to the road. Some were trying to reach family. Some were emergency workers. Some underestimated the danger, because people often do, especially in places used to harsh winters, and some had no real choice at all. Workplaces, hospitals, police, fire departments, utility crews, and countless others could not simply declare the city paused and go home for tea. So the streets remained full of shapes that no longer behaved like streets. Cars remained visible and invisible in uneven measure. Familiar routes became trapped lines. Major roads became a record of halted movement. Residential blocks became sealed pockets of waiting. And across all of it, the snow kept shifting, packing and hardening, as though the storm was not satisfied with merely stopping the city, and intended also to hide the fact that it had ever moved. That is where the story begins to narrow from the citywide view to the human one. Because once the roads failed and the cars lost their usefulness, people were left wherever the storm had caught them. At home, at work, in schools, in public buildings, in stalled vehicles, in factories, in offices, in stores, in hospitals, and in that awkward middle ground between one place and another, where a journey had been interrupted so completely that destination no longer mattered nearly as much as shelter. By early afternoon on Friday, January 28th, Buffalo had reached the point where a city can still be physically present and yet feel, in every practical sense, as though it has slipped out of view. That kind of disappearance is not cinematic. Buildings do not vanish in one clean motion. Streets do not politely fold themselves away. What happens instead is less tidy, and in some ways more unsettling. The signs of a functioning city begin to fail one after another. You can no longer tell where the road is. You can no longer reach the corner store. You can no longer see the next block. Police cars cannot move properly. Ploughs turn back. Workers are sent home and do not make it home. The city remains where it has always been, but it stops behaving like a place people can cross. In Buffalo, the moment that change became undeniable came very quickly. Observers on the 16th floor of the M&T Bank building watched what they described as a grey wall advancing over the city around 11:10 a.m, then turning white as it drew closer until the whole building was swallowed by it. Minutes later, visibility at the airport dropped from 3/4 of a mile to 0 and stayed there into the next day. A lot of disasters begin with noise, but this one began with erasure. The city's usual outline was taken away piece by piece. First the far-off details disappeared, then the near ones. By late morning, Buffalo ploughs were already returning to their garages because the drivers could not see well enough to keep working, reporting that they could not even see their own plough blades. Most city workers were released around 11:30 a.m, but few managed to reach home. That is a small set of facts on paper, yet it contains the whole emotional turn of the day. A workplace ceases to be a temporary place, and becomes the place you are in now. A ride home ceases to be routine and becomes doubtful. What had looked like a winter Friday became in less than an hour a city-wide problem of shelter, distance, and luck. There is something unnerving about a major city losing not only movement, but legibility. Buffalo was a city of roughly 463,000 people at the time, with about 1.5 million in the metropolitan area. It was not a small town tucked into a valley where a single blocked road could isolate everyone. It was one of New York State's major urban centres, a place built on traffic, workplaces, routes, deliveries, and ordinary weekday patterns. Yet once the storm reached full force, those patterns stopped meaning very much. Roads became impassable in parts of the city within about 30 minutes, especially in areas closest to Lake Erie. By 1 o'clock, bumper-high snow was already being reported, and by nightfall, drifts had reached around 15 feet in the city, with much larger ones elsewhere in the wider metropolitan area. In other words, Buffalo did not merely get a bad day of weather, it lost the practical use of its own shape, and when a city loses its shape, people start relying on smaller, stranger methods just to remain attached to one another. During the blizzard, pedestrians in downtown Buffalo were reportedly knocked down by the wind and struggled to stay on their feet. Police officers had to work in pairs to pull people into buildings. Human chains were formed from Memorial Auditorium to stranded cars so motorists could find shelter without getting lost in the whiteout. That is a detail worth sitting with. A modern city had been reduced for a time to the oldest method of group safety there is, one person holding onto the next because the space between a car and a building had become dangerous enough to swallow orientation. By Friday evening, authorities estimated that 13,000 people were stranded in downtown Buffalo alone. Others were stuck at industrial plants in surrounding communities, including about 1,700 at Bell Aerosystems in Wheatfield and 2,500 at Harrison Radiator in Lockport. Hundreds sheltered in major public buildings, among them the Donovan State Office Building, the Rath Building and Memorial Auditorium. That is part of what people mean when they say a city disappeared in the storm. They do not mean that Buffalo ceased to exist. They mean that ordinary categories collapsed. Office buildings became dormitories, auditoriums became emergency shelters, factories became holding places for night after night. A workday stopped being a workday and turned into a question of where you would sleep, what you would eat, and whether anybody at home knew where you were. From outside, especially to someone seeing it later in photographs or television coverage, the city may have looked buried. From inside, it likely felt more like it had been broken into sealed compartments. One group of people was stranded downtown, another was trapped at work in the suburbs, another was stuck at home behind drifted doors, another was sitting in a car that no longer offered much certainty. Communication still existed, but movement had failed. That distinction matters. A place can talk and still not be able to reach. Radio and television broadcasts continued to matter enormously, because with the streets useless and visibility gone, information became one of the only things that could still move at speed. Through those broadcasts, Buffalo police asked residents to loan snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles, because by Friday evening many roads were so impassable that the police themselves were nearly immobile. That is the sort of sentence that tells you the city has crossed into another condition. When police in a major American city have to ask citizens, by radio and television, to lend snowmobiles so emergency calls can be answered, the normal machinery of urban life has already failed. It does not mean everyone was helpless. Far from it. People adapted fast. Snowmobile clubs volunteered, four-wheel drive owners went out, the National Guard assisted. But adaptation is not the same as normal function. Buffalo was no longer relying on the systems it usually used to carry itself through a winter day. It was improvising with whatever could still move across the surface that remained. Some of the city's most basic services were interrupted in ways that made the whole event feel even more unreal. On Saturday, the Buffalo Courier-Express failed to publish for the first time in its 143-year history. The Buffalo Evening News managed only about 10,000 copies. Mail service in the city did not resume until Wednesday, February 2nd, when four-wheel drive trucks brought in from Rochester helped make the first deliveries since the previous Friday. Intercity bus service, Amtrak trains, and commercial air service to Buffalo were all halted from when the blizzard struck on Friday until Monday. Those details are not dramatic in the same way that buried houses are dramatic. but they are some of the clearest signs of disappearance. The newspaper does not arrive, the mail does not come, trains stop, planes stop. The larger network that connects a city to the rest of the country falls quiet. Even the airport, which tends to symbolise connection and movement more than almost any other place, became a kind of still point inside the storm. 3 airplanes were on the tarmac waiting to take off when the whiteout hit. One aircraft's nose wheel froze after idling in the blizzard, and it took hours to bring all 3 back to the terminal, guided by radio because the pilots could not see the ground crews who would normally direct them. The airport had already closed the day before under worsening conditions, and by the time the blizzard fully struck, air travel had become one more part of ordinary life suspended by weather that had gone well beyond inconvenience. A city can feel missing even to itself when its airport becomes a place where airplanes cannot find their way across the ground. What also made Buffalo seem to disappear was the way the storm worked on perspective. In a normal snowfall, the city remains visible under weather. In the blizzard of 77, snow and wind kept taking away the distances that help people understand where they are. The frozen surface of Lake Erie, covered in deep powder, fed vast quantities of blowing snow into western New York, and much of the snow that buried Buffalo during the blizzard was not new snow falling from the sky so much as old snow picked up and moved again. By early afternoon, radar suggested there was little actual falling snow over Buffalo, yet the city was in full whiteout because the wind was lifting snow from the lake and from the ground and driving it across streets and buildings. The result was a place that seemed to erase itself from the ground up. That helps explain why people described walls of snow, why roads vanished in half an hour, and why even those attempting to travel on foot could become disoriented so fast. The Syracuse University Press account of the storm notes that drivers encountered walls of snow that obliterated vision, that cars and buses stopped and quickly became stranded, and that it could take hours to travel a few city blocks. This was not a city where movement had merely become slow. It was a city where short distance had stopped behaving properly. A block could take an hour. A building could be visible and still hard to reach. A car could be nearby and effectively lost. In practical terms, Buffalo had become much larger and much smaller at the same time. Larger because movement between points was so difficult. Smaller because many people were reduced to the single building, vehicle or room where the storm had caught them. The visual record from after the blizzard helps make that easier to grasp. Photo collections from the Buffalo Courier Express show streets narrowed into tunnels, cars buried near major roadways, aerial views of homes almost lost under drifts, and even people moving through city streets on inner tubes and skis once the immediate danger eased enough for such improvisations to appear. These were not scenes from remote rural roads. They were scenes from an American city that for several days looked as though winter had pressed the reset button on ground level. Roads resembled trenches. Houses seemed to rise out of snow rather than sit upon land. Cars became lumps. Intersections became blank spaces with only the faintest evidence that traffic once had rules there. The phrase, "This city is fighting for its life," attributed to Mayor Stanley Makowski, has endured because it captures the mood without exaggeration. It sounds dramatic until you set it beside the facts. There were dozens of deaths across the affected region, many involving people trapped in vehicles. Police mobility was crippled. Fire crews had to ram through stalled cars and stretch hoses for blocks during a major fire at Whitney Place and Virginia Street, while freezing water and blocked drains turned firefighting itself into another battle with the storm. Volunteers were delivering food, blood and medicine by snowmobile and four-wheel drive. The mayor was not reaching for grand language. He was describing a city that for those days had to fight simply to keep reaching its own people. One reason this part of the story still feels so eerie is that Buffalo did not disappear all at once and stay gone in a single neat way. It flickered in and out of partial visibility and partial access. On Sunday morning, January 30th, the wind and snow decreased somewhat, and some sun was visible. city ploughs and state equipment managed to open several major roads. That might have felt for a few hours like the city was coming back into focus. But then the weather turned mean again. Sightseers and extra drivers came in on those partly cleared roads. The wind increased around mid-afternoon, visibility dropped, and hundreds more people were stranded while abandoned cars reblocked the very routes that had just been reclaimed. Buffalo did not simply vanish once. It kept trying to reappear, only to be pushed back under drifting snow. That repeated undoing must have been exhausting in a way that statistics cannot show. The eye sees a little sun. The plough gets through. A few roads reopen. Someone thinks tomorrow will be closer to normal. Then the wind rises again, and with it comes the insult of realizing that the city is still not ready to be used. A blizzard like this does not only bury buildings and vehicles, it buries confidence. It makes every improvement feel conditional. It teaches people not to trust a clear patch of road or a bright patch of sky without waiting to see what the wind plans to do next. Buffalo's problem was not just that it was hidden, it was that every attempt to uncover it could be reversed. By Monday and Tuesday, the official language of emergency had caught up with what residents already knew from experience. Governor Hugh Carey requested federal disaster help. President Jimmy Carter issued an emergency declaration, and later a major disaster declaration followed. The first time a snowstorm in the United States had received that level of federal disaster status. On February 1st, Mayor Murkowski declared a state of emergency prohibiting non-essential travel in Buffalo, with penalties that included fines and possible jail time. These government actions matter historically, but what they really show is something simpler. Buffalo had reached a point where normal civic rules were no longer enough. The city required special status because it was, in the plainest sense, not operating as a normal city. By then, the sense of disappearance had widened beyond the local. National media spent days showing images of Buffalo under enormous drifts, and for many people elsewhere in the country, the city briefly became synonymous with burial, whiteout, and stalled life. That outside view can flatten things a bit because it turns a living place into a symbol. But it also reflected something true. For nearly a week, Buffalo was not being seen in the usual American way, as a place of neighbourhoods, jobs, routines, and familiar urban mess. It was being seen as a snowbound absence, a place where roofs and drifts and stuck machinery had replaced the expected picture. Still, disappearance is never complete as long as people remain inside it, doing ordinary, stubborn human things. Someone was checking on a neighbour. Someone was trying to clear a vent pipe. Someone was stretching food a little farther. Someone was listening to the radio in a building not meant for sleeping. Someone was looking out from a downtown office tower at a city that seemed to have turned into weather. Someone was in a car hoping the person at home would understand why they had not arrived. Someone else was at home realising that the person in the car might not be arriving at all that night. These are the details that keep a city real, even when its public outline disappears. And that is perhaps the truest version of what happened. Buffalo did not vanish, because every building was hidden at once. Buffalo vanished because the connections between people, places and routines were cut or narrowed until daily life could no longer flow normally through the streets. The city became a set of sealed pockets, workplaces full of stranded workers, public buildings full of unexpected overnight guests, homes blocked by drifts, hospitals reachable only with effort, streets covered with abandoned vehicles, news delayed, mail delayed, travel halted. The map still existed, but it could not be used in the ways it usually was. Once that happens, a city does not need to be physically erased to feel absent. So when people later remembered the blizzard of 77 as the day an entire city seemed to disappear, they were not speaking loosely. They were describing the practical sensation of living in a place that had been cut into pieces by wind, snow, distance, and cold. Buffalo was still there, certainly. The houses stood, the churches stood, the office towers stood, but for a while the city could only be experienced in fragments, and people were left in whatever fragment the storm had handed them, whether that was home, work, a public shelter, or that difficult strip of interrupted life somewhere in between. What made the blizzard of 77 so frightening was not only that it buried Buffalo, it also sorted people into separate worlds almost at random and then made it terribly difficult to move between them. One person was stuck in a downtown office building with hundreds of strangers and a vending machine that suddenly seemed very important. Another was marooned in a factory outside the city with co-workers, fluorescent lights, and the uneasy feeling that one ordinary work day had quietly turned into an overnight stay and then another. Someone else was at home, warm enough for the moment, but unable to open a drifted door properly and beginning to count food, medicine, candles and patience with a seriousness that had not seemed necessary the day before. And then there were the people caught in the worst place of all, somewhere between one destination and another, in cars that had stopped being transportation and become small, uncertain shelters in a storm with no respect for plans. The weather did not trap everyone in the same way. It individualized the trouble. That is often what makes a disaster linger in memory. Everyone remembers the same storm, but not the same confinement. In Buffalo and across western New York, whiteout conditions trapped people at work, in cars and in homes. Some stayed put for a day, while others remained stranded for much longer. Downtown Buffalo on that Friday night was full of people who had started the day assuming they would go to work and then come home as usual. Instead, authorities estimated that around 13,000 people were stranded downtown by Friday evening. Some slept in the Donovan State Office Building, where about 700 people stayed. Another 200 stayed in the Rath Building. About 300 ended up in Memorial Auditorium. Those are the sort of numbers that make a city disaster feel oddly domestic. They are not just statistics. They are human bodies spread across office floors, benches, hallways, public rooms, and whatever temporary sleeping arrangements could be improvised once it became obvious no one was going anywhere soon. A downtown building is not designed to become a boarding house without warning, yet that is what many of them became. Lights stayed on, coats became blankets, coffee became a strategic resource. Familiar co-workers became your storm companions whether you'd chosen them for that role or not. It is easy to picture the first few hours of that unexpected indoor captivity. At first, people probably treated it like a delay. They phoned home if they could, they looked out the windows, they swapped rumours. Maybe someone said the roads would be open in an hour or two, because in every emergency there is always at least one person who believes in the healing power of saying something hopeful in a very certain voice. Then more time passed. The wind did not let up. Visibility did not meaningfully return. The line between inconvenience and entrapment hardened. In office buildings, somebody would have started organising blankets or food. Someone else would have checked on older employees. A manager who had spent the morning thinking about payroll or meetings might have spent the evening worrying about where people would sleep and whether the heat would hold. Normal roles blur quickly in a storm. The person with keys becomes important. The person who knows where the emergency supplies are becomes important. The person who can stay calm without becoming cheerful to the point of insult becomes very important indeed. Outside the city centre, workers were trapped in other kinds of places entirely. Authorities estimated that around 1,700 people were stuck at Bell Aerosystems in Wheatfield, and about 2,500 at Harrison Radiator in Lockport. Those are not small figures. They suggest whole industrial spaces abruptly changing function. A plant that exists for manufacturing suddenly becomes a shelter. Production floors become waiting areas. Offices become sleeping rooms. Break rooms become supply points. A person who had packed a lunch for a shift now had to think in terms of staying the night, perhaps longer. In some cases, volunteer emergency groups and the Red Cross set up assistance directly at such sites, while snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles were dispatched to move supplies and respond to urgent needs. What had been a place of clocks, shifts, and output became a place of endurance. There is a particular emotional awkwardness to being trapped at work that feels different from being trapped at home. At home, even in danger, you're at least surrounded by your own objects, your own kitchen, your own familiar irritation with that one drafty window or that one door that never shuts correctly. At work, you are stranded inside an environment built around tasks, not comfort. Factory floors are not restful places. Office furniture is not meant for sleep. Public buildings may be large, but they are not intimate. Even a heated room can feel bleak when it was designed for paperwork and routine rather than waiting out a disaster. And yet people adapted because adaptation is what people do. They found corners, shared food, passed along rumours, tried not to think too far ahead, counted the hours, looked out at a city they could not reach, and probably kept replaying the same thought. I should have left earlier, though of course that thought is mostly useless once the storm has already made its decision. Meanwhile, many others were trapped in the place that might sound safest from a distance, home, but home in a blizzard is only comforting up to the point where it begins to seal itself. Syracuse University Press's History of the Storm notes that hundreds of thousands of people were stuck in their homes across the affected region, and some lacked heat, food, and medicine. That sentence carries much more weight than its calm wording suggests. Being at home during a major blizzard is not automatically cozy. It depends on heat. It depends on supplies. It depends on whether someone in the house needs medication. It depends on whether an elderly relative lives alone nearby. It depends on whether the doors can still open and the vents can still breathe. A house in winter is a system, and the moment any part of that system becomes uncertain, the feeling of shelter changes. Imagine a household on one of those nights. The radio is on because radio matters again whenever the roads fail. Boots are lined up by the door not because anyone expects a pleasant outing, but because there may come a point when going outside becomes necessary rather than optional. Someone keeps brushing snow away from a drifted entrance, or checking that a furnace vent is clear. Someone else opens the pantry with more seriousness than usual and starts doing quiet arithmetic. How many loaves? How much milk? Is there enough coffee? How long would this all last if it had to? There is always something oddly revealing about storm inventories. They reduce life to basics very quickly. Heat, water, light, food, medicine, news, contact. Buffalo households were dealing with exactly those calculations while the city beyond them became harder and harder to reach. And then there were the people stuck in between, the ones caught on roads, expressways, bridges and access routes when the city closed around them. Many victims of the storm were later found in half-buried cars. The National Weather Service notes that the deadly wind chill likely contributed to the deaths of 29 people, many discovered frozen in those vehicles during the 4-day ordeal. The Red Cross later sent volunteers on snowmobiles to check abandoned cars because officials feared some people were still trapped inside, and one widely shared photograph from that effort showed a car buried under a 10-foot drift. That is the bleak middle ground of this story. Not home, not work, not a public shelter, just a car, a stalled line of traffic, maybe a building somewhere nearby if visibility would allow it, and the impossible little decisions that come with weather severe enough to make every choice feel partly wrong. A person trapped in a car has a different kind of clock. At home, you can at least pace from room to room. At work, you may have other people around you. In a vehicle, space shrinks to the width of the doors and the radius of whatever heat remains. Snow builds around the body of the car. The windows become less useful. Outside, landmarks vanish. The storm keeps making the vehicle smaller by making the world around it less readable. And the mind, unhelpfully, continues to think in ordinary commuter terms for longer than it should. Maybe traffic will move. Maybe the plough is ahead. Maybe if I wait a little longer. That is one of the cruelest tricks blizzards play. They let normal expectation linger just long enough to become dangerous. Rescue efforts during the storm show just how many people were stranded in that uncomfortable middle state. Snowmobiles were used to rescue people from the Buffalo Skyway and another expressway. Firefighters used snowmobiles to rescue trapped people and to transport nurses and doctors to hospitals, while 4-wheel drive vehicles delivered medicine. The Red Cross opened 8 shelters in Erie County on Friday, and snowmobile clubs supplied volunteers to move food, blood, and medical supplies through places where ordinary vehicles could no longer function. Even that sounds almost too neat when written down. In reality, it must have been improvised, exhausting, cold work carried out in a city where roads existed mostly as memory. There is something revealing in the fact that snowmobiles became so central. They are not symbols of orderly city life. They are what you use when orderly city life has been suspended and the landscape under you has stopped cooperating with wheels and traffic laws. Buffalo police were almost immobile by Friday evening, and through radio and television citizens were asked to loan snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles so officers could answer calls. That detail makes the city feel split into two kinds of people for a while: those who were trapped and those who could still move across the new surface because they had the right machine and the nerve to use it. And even that second group was not exactly free. They were moving through a place that had become hazardous in entirely new ways. Hospitals and emergency workers sat in a category all their own. They could not simply stop because the weather had become unreasonable. Patients still needed care. Fires still had to be fought. Medicine still had to move. At one major fire on Whitney Place and Virginia Street, fire trucks had to ram through stalled cars to get close, and hoses were stretched 2 to 3 blocks because that was as far as the trucks could manage. Firefighters later used snowmobiles to rescue trapped people and to carry nurses and doctors to hospitals. Even the act of putting out a fire became a struggle against blocked streets, frozen equipment, and sheer access. 6 or 7 houses were destroyed in that fire, leaving around 50 people homeless on top of everything else. So in the middle of a storm that was already trapping people at home and at work, others were being made suddenly homeless as well, which is about as harsh a reminder as one could ask for that disasters rarely have the decency to arrive one at a time. Some people were trapped even before the best-known day of the blizzard. The airport had closed on Thursday, January 27th, and roads such as the Skyway and Fuhrman Boulevard were already causing serious problems. Later, workers at the Freezer Queen plant remained trapped until Fuhrman Boulevard was finally cleared on Wednesday, February 2nd, allowing them to leave after being stuck since Friday. Coast Guard personnel behind 15-foot drifts at the end of that road were also freed only then. There is a brutal simplicity to those dates. Friday to Wednesday. Not one uncomfortable night, not one dramatic afternoon. Nearly a week measured in delayed departures, shared food, improvised sleeping arrangements, and the mental fatigue of remaining stuck after everyone has already used up the sentence "surely tomorrow" several times too many. It is also worth remembering that all of this was happening during a broader winter energy crisis. New York had imposed natural gas emergency measures just before the blizzard, and in western New York hundreds of industries had gas supplies cut off, while tens of thousands of commercial businesses saw curtailed service. Syracuse University Press notes that some homes lacked heat during the storm, which means being trapped at home could be far more serious than simply being snowed in. The romantic version of a blizzard assumes you're indoors, warm, supplied, and mildly inconvenienced. The real version depends on infrastructure holding when it's already under pressure. A house without heat in that weather is not a cozy retreat. It is a countdown. There is a hard, practical loneliness in each form of being trapped. At home, the loneliness may come from not knowing how or when help could reach you. At work, it may come from being far from family and stuck among people who are familiar but not intimate. In a car, it may come from the terrifying possibility that shelter is close and still unreachable. Yet there is another side to the story as well, and it appears almost immediately whenever the normal systems fail. Volunteers on four-wheel drive vehicles and snowmobiles delivered food for the Salvation Army in Buffalo at an astonishing pace, described as a few $1,000s worth every 45 minutes. The Red Cross distributed food widely, and shelters opened quickly. A Salvation Army official later said the disaster was unique because it covered 9 counties and nobody could get in. That phrase catches the scale of the isolation, but the rescue work also shows something else. When official movement stopped, personal movement took over. People with the right vehicles, local knowledge, or stubborn enough temperaments became the temporary circulatory system of the city. Even so, none of that made the experience gentle. Think of the emotional mismatch involved. A person at home knows family members are somewhere else in the storm. A person at work knows home exists but cannot be reached. A person in a car knows both home and work exist and neither one is helping much right now. Everyone is fixed in place but fixed in different ways. Some are fed but worried. Some are sheltered but cold. Some are among crowds but feel isolated. Some are alone in a vehicle, staring through half-covered glass at a world that no longer looks arranged for human use. Buffalo was not only immobilized, it was fragmented into little units of waiting. That fragmentation also changed how people understood time. A normal Friday turns into an overnight stay turns into missing Saturday. Saturday turns into, perhaps, the realization that the storm is not done and the roads may not really exist in usable form yet. Then comes Sunday's false improvement, when some roads reopen and sunlight appears, and people allow themselves to imagine movement again. But the wind rises, visibility drops, and hundreds more become stranded anew, with abandoned cars once again blocking roads that had just been cleared. That repeated setback mattered psychologically. It meant that even people who were technically sheltered could not trust the idea of going anywhere soon. The city kept offering little glimpses of return and then snatching them back. By the time travel bans and emergency declarations caught up with the livid reality, Buffalo had already been living for days in this split condition, with home, work, and the road between them transformed into entirely different kinds of confinement. The National Weather Service later described the scene revealed when the sun finally came out for good on February 1st as one of incredible desolation, and noted that traffic was banned for several days afterward. That phrase feels right because the storm had done more than produce snow. It had interrupted the very ordinary movement by which a city remains a city. People were left wherever the blizzard had chosen to sort them. Some were fortunate, some were frightened, some were exhausted beyond words, and many, after all of it, would remember not just the scale of the storm, but the strangely specific little prison it had assigned to them, whether that prison had walls, a steering wheel, or simply a drifted front door and no clear way through it yet. Which is where the story begins to turn toward the people who went out anyway. Not because the weather invited them, but because someone always has to move first through a buried place. What turned the blizzard of 77 from a story of paralysis into a story of effort was the simple fact that some people went out anyway. They went out when the roads had stopped behaving like roads, when police cars could barely move, when ambulances were struggling, when fire trucks were freezing, and when the ordinary systems a city depends on had become unreliable all at once. They went out on snowmobiles, in four-wheel drive trucks, on foot where they had to, and with the sort of stubborn practical courage that rarely looks dramatic in the moment because it is too busy being useful. In Buffalo, once the storm closed the city down, the people who could still move became more than volunteers or responders. For a while, they became the city's legs. Buffalo police were nearly immobile by Friday evening and asked residents through radio and television to loan snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles so officers could answer calls. Snowmobiles were then used to rescue stranded motorists, carry doctors and nurses, and deliver food, blood and medicine. There is something very plain and human about that shift. A modern city likes to imagine itself in official vehicles and organised routes, in dispatch systems and predictable lanes, in equipment that looks municipal and behaves accordingly. But a buried city does not always get to keep that version of itself. Sometimes it has to borrow motion from whoever has the right machine in the garage and enough nerve to start it in impossible weather. That was Buffalo during those days. Snowmobiles, which under ordinary circumstances might have meant recreation, weekend noise, or a certain sort of local winter pride, suddenly became emergency transportation. They were no longer hobbies, they were practical answers. The same machine that might once have carried someone over a field for sport was now ferrying medical staff to hospitals and checking on stranded people in neighbourhoods ordinary vehicles could no longer reach. it helps to picture what the city was asking these people to move through. The National Weather Service records that when the Arctic front crossed Buffalo late Friday morning, visibility dropped from 3/4 of a mile to 0, and by late afternoon, sustained winds at the airport averaged 46 miles per hour with gusts to 69. Those winds took about 2 inches of fresh powder, combined them with an existing snowpack of roughly 37 inches and older drifts from previous storms, and turned the whole city into a place of packed snow, blind corners, and blocked routes. Streets were already so clogged before the main whiteout that the National Guard had been called in even before anyone realised how severe the blizzard would become. This matters because it means the rescuers were not entering a city that was merely difficult. They were entering one that had already been half lost before the worst of the wind arrived, and in that kind of place, sirens begin to mean something slightly different. Under normal conditions, a siren promises movement. It implies that someone is coming through traffic, that lanes will part, that the route, however crowded, still functions enough for urgency to pass. In the blizzard of 77, the sound could still carry, but the vehicle attached to it might not get very far. That is one of the reasons the story turns so strongly toward improvisation. A city can keep all the official urgency at once, but if the truck is stuck, the ambulance is blocked, or the police cruiser can no longer make headway, then help has to arrive by less dignified means. Less dignified perhaps, but no less heroic. Snowmobile clubs, private four-wheel drive owners, National Guard personnel, Red Cross workers, Salvation Army volunteers and local responders all ended up carrying parts of the load because there was no one tidy system left to do it alone. The rescue work took many forms. Some of it was direct and urgent, the sort of thing no one has to explain twice. People were trapped in cars on expressways and major roads. Snowmobiles were used to rescue people from the Buffalo Skyway and from another expressway as the city's normal traffic network fell apart. Other runs were quieter but no less important. Food had to move, medicine had to move, blood had to move, doctors and nurses had to move. People who were not yet in immediate danger could become so if left too long without heat, medication, or information. The Red Cross opened 8 shelters in Erie County on Friday, and snowmobile clubs supplied volunteers to deliver food, blood, and medicine. Volunteers on four-wheel drive vehicles and snowmobiles delivered food for the Salvation Army from its Buffalo headquarters at a pace described as several $1,000s worth every 45 minutes. That is not a picturesque detail. It is the sound of a city trying to feed itself after the roads have quit. There is also something telling about the pace of those runs. Every 45 minutes, more food out into the storm. That suggests constant demand, repeated trips, and a city full of people who are not simply inconvenienced but cut off. It suggests homes where pantry calculations were getting serious, shelters filling up, workers stranded in industrial sites, families unable to get to stores, and aid organisations suddenly functioning like dispatch centres in a snowbound maze. Buffalo was not only buried, it was hungry in the practical sense that all trapped populations eventually are. And because the weather was too severe for ordinary deliveries, the people with snowmobiles and working trucks became the ones who made supply lines possible. Some of the hardest work fell to firefighters, because fires do not take snow days and frozen streets do not impress a burning building into courtesy. One of the most striking episodes of the blizzard came on Friday evening at Whitney Place and Virginia Street in Buffalo, where a major fire broke out during the storm. Fire trucks had to ram through stalled cars to try to reach the scene. Hoses were stretched 2 to 3 blocks because that was as close as the trucks could get. The National Guard helped move firefighters in four-wheel drive vehicles. At the scene, the weather kept sabotaging the work. Water froze, hoses burst. Runoff collected around the equipment and froze so badly that jackhammers were needed to free some of the pumpers. Several fire trucks stalled in the snow or had their water freeze in the engines, ruining them. The fire was finally extinguished, but not before 6 or 7 houses were destroyed and around 50 people were left homeless. It is difficult to imagine a more exhausting combination of problems. A city already buried under drift suddenly has to fight fire in conditions where water itself becomes an enemy. Firefighters must get to the scene through abandoned vehicles, then drag hoses over ice and snow, while the weather works on the equipment as actively as the flames work on the houses. Every part of the response becomes heavier, slower, and more brittle. Even success looks terrible by the end of it. The fire is out, but homes are gone. The trucks have done their duty, but some are frozen and wrecked. The street remains blocked for weeks. And still, in the middle of that mess, firefighters use snowmobiles to rescue trapped people and to transport nurses and doctors to hospitals, while four-wheel drive vehicles carried medicine. The same storm that made them less effective by one measure forced them to become more inventive by another. That practical inventiveness runs through the entire rescue story. Nobody waited for a perfect arrangement because no perfect arrangement was available. The Buffalo police asked for civilian help because their own mobility had been crippled. The Red Cross opened shelters quickly because people were already stranded. Snowmobile clubs provided volunteers because snowmobiles could go where ordinary vehicles could not. The National Guard assisted with road clearing and emergency movement because city resources had been overwhelmed. By Saturday night, National Guardsmen in cold weather gear were helping Buffalo Street's sanitation department clear roads to hospitals, and before the end of the storm, more than 500 guardsmen had joined the disaster effort. Elsewhere in the wider response, federal and military resources added more personnel and equipment as the cleanup and rescue work expanded. That image of guardsmen helping clear roads to hospitals matters. Since Friday afternoon, according to contemporary accounts summarised in later sources, walking multiple blocks had been necessary to reach most hospitals in Buffalo. Hospitals are the sort of places a city assumes it will always be able to reach somehow. They are fixed points in the civic imagination, almost like train stations or water towers. You do not usually think of them as remote. Yet during the blizzard of '77, even hospitals acquired that faraway quality because the streets leading to them had become buried, blocked, or both. So people with the right equipment, and often the right kind of stubbornness, were out there trying to reconnect the city to the places it could least afford to lose. There is a temptation, when telling stories like this, to make everyone who ventured out sound uniformly fearless. Real life is usually less polished. Many of the people who went out anyway were probably frightened. Some were surely exhausted. Some may have been simply too busy to feel anything clearly in the moment. Courage in a blizzard often looks like a person concentrating on the next trip, the next patient, the next address, the next call crackling over the radio. It is not always grand. Sometimes it is just repeated usefulness under bad conditions. A snowmobile rider checks another abandoned vehicle. A four-wheel drive driver makes another food run. A firefighter goes back out because someone still needs transport. A National Guardsman helps open one more route to a hospital. No speech, no flourish, just another run into a city the weather has tried to lock shut. That is part of what makes the rescue side of the story so compelling. It is full of people behaving as though the conditions were not acceptable, and then acting accordingly. At the same time, the storm never stopped being dangerous even for the people trying to help. Snowmobiles, useful as they were, became hazards in their own right, once the drifts grew high enough to alter the whole vertical shape of neighbourhoods. By Saturday evening, some areas of western New York had banned not only regular traffic, but even snowmobiles. One rider was injured in a collision with a chimney on top of a house, and others came dangerously close to power lines because the drifts had lifted them so high. In Newstead, drifts around 30 feet deep led to the suspension of even emergency snowmobile traffic because of the danger from power lines. That detail is almost absurd until you remember what drifting snow can do. It can make the ground rise toward rooftops and wires until the city becomes physically unfamiliar even from a moving rescue vehicle. So the people who went out anyway were not operating in a stable alternate transport system, as though the city had neatly switched from cars to sleds, and everything proceeded in an orderly new mode. They were moving through an unstable environment where even the improvised solutions had risks. Snowmobiles could reach places trucks could not. but only if the route was not hiding a chimney, a power line, a buried obstacle, or some fresh drift packed hard enough to change everything again. Four-wheel drive vehicles could push farther than sedans, but they were still entering streets clogged with stranded cars and deep snow. Even walking could be treacherous in a city where visibility had collapsed, and the difference between road, sidewalk, and drift was often gone. The rescuers did not solve the storm, they kept operating inside it. That distinction matters because it keeps the story honest. The blizzard did not turn into a triumph of plucky winter machinery. It remained a blizzard, and a deadly one. The National Weather Service records 29 deaths in western New York and southern Ontario, many involving people found frozen in half-buried cars, with brutal wind chill as a major factor. The Syracuse University press account similarly describes drivers encountering walls of snow, abandoning vehicles, and nearly freezing as temperatures dropped to zero and wind chills approached -70 by the old calculation then in use. So when people went out anyway, they were not entering a difficult but manageable inconvenience. They were entering conditions already severe enough to kill, and yet they kept going. Snowmobiles became emergency vehicles, trucks became supply lines, public shelters became way stations in a city with broken circulation. The Salvation Army fed and housed large numbers of people during the disaster, using around 1,000 volunteers and more than 400 snowmobiles over the course of the response according to later summaries. Military and civilian resources piled in as the days went on, not because anyone was eager for a display of coordination, but because Buffalo needed bodies, engines, blades, radios, and food wherever they could be found. The storm had turned local knowledge into a life-saving asset. People who knew the roads, knew the neighbourhoods, knew which route dipped where and which side street might still be passable, suddenly mattered in a different way. In a buried city, geography belongs to whoever can still read it. There is something else worth noticing in all this. Rescue in a blizzard is not always dramatic in the cinematic sense. Quite often it is intimate. It is somebody getting medicine to a house, somebody transporting a nurse, somebody checking whether an abandoned car still has a person inside, somebody carrying food to a shelter, somebody pulling a stranded motorist into a building, human chains forming between a downtown venue and trapped cars so people can find their way without vanishing into the whiteout. These acts are small compared with the scale of the storm, but they are exactly how a city begins to hold together again when the larger systems are failing. Buffalo's salvation during those first days was not some single, magnificent intervention descending out of the sky. It was 1,000 useful acts performed by people who either had no choice or decided that someone had to be the one to go. That is why the memory of the blizzard is not only about buried cars and impossible drifts. It is also about the sound of engines that did still start, the shrill movement of sirens that meant someone was trying, the rough practicality of snowmobiles cutting through streets that no longer looked like streets, and the stubborn refusal of responders and volunteers to let the city remain entirely sealed. Buffalo had been cut into compartments by wind, cold, and snow. The people who went out anyway became the first rough lines connecting those compartments again. They did not make the city normal. That would take much longer, but they kept it from becoming only a collection of isolated rooms and stranded vehicles. They gave it motion where motion had nearly ended. And once those runs began, once food and medicine and medical staff could be moved at all, the next struggle became what awaited at the far end of those trips. Houses with dwindling supplies, dark rooms, blocked doors, kitchens trying to stay warm, and families learning that surviving a blizzard is not only about rescue from outside, but also about how people endure the long hours inside when the wind is still at the windows and the city beyond them has not fully come back yet. Once the first rush of the blizzard had passed and the city had been sorted into all its separate pockets of waiting, Buffalo entered the part of the disaster that often lasts longest in memory. Not the dramatic arrival, not the wall of snow moving across downtown, not the first buried cars. It was what came after, When people were indoors, the roads were gone, the wind was still at the windows, and the simple business of getting through the next several hours became the main event. This is the part of a storm that does not always photograph well. It happens in kitchens, hallways, stairwells, office floors, shelter cots, school cafeterias, factory break rooms, and living rooms where the radio stays on because the outside world can no longer be checked by stepping onto the porch and taking a quick look. Buffalo and the wider region were not merely snowed in. Transportation, utilities, and other vital services were failing across western New York, and hundreds of thousands of people were stuck at home, some without enough heat, food, or medicine. A house during a blizzard can be either a comfort or a worry, and the difference often comes down to systems you do not think about much until they are threatened. Heat matters first, then light, then food, then whether anyone in the house needs medicine, then whether the vent is clear, whether the pipes are holding, whether the car in the driveway is any use at all, and whether the people you care about are safely indoors somewhere else. The winter of 1976 to 77 had already been severe before the blizzard arrived. Buffalo had gone through a brutally cold January, with temperatures staying below freezing the entire month, and by January 28th, there was already deep snow on the ground and on frozen Lake Erie. The blizzard then drove wind chills to around -60 by the old formula, which meant that even a brief trip outside was serious business. A warm kitchen was not a cosy seasonal detail at that point. It was a line between manageable discomfort and something much worse. The phrase cold kitchens fits because kitchens are where people start measuring a storm honestly, not in poetry, in groceries, in half loaves, coffee tins, soup cans, jars, milk, bread, medicine, bottled water if there is any, and all the other ordinary things that suddenly feel much more valuable when the roads are blocked and no delivery truck is coming. Syracuse University Press's History of the Blizzard notes that hundreds of thousands of people were stuck in their homes and that some lacked heat, food, and medicine. That is the kind of sentence that looks calm on a page and feels much sharper when you unpack it. Lacking heat means rooms become unusable or dangerous. Lacking food means the day is organised around rationing and substitution. Lacking medicine means the storm stops being merely a story about weather and becomes a story about time running in the wrong direction. Even before the blizzard fully hit, the region was already dealing with an energy problem. On January 27th, severe natural gas shortages forced industries and schools to curtail activities or close, and the power company had warned that snow was reaching power lines in some parts of western New York. That means many households and workplaces entered the blizzard already knowing that energy was not something to take for granted. A storm always feels different when the question is not only whether the roads will close, but whether the basic systems of heat and power are under strain before the main emergency even starts. It changes the mood inside a house. You listen to the furnace differently. You notice each lamp. You become aware of every draft in the room. That is where the dark rooms part comes in, and it does not need much decoration. A dark room in a storm is simply a room where options have narrowed. Maybe the power is gone. Maybe the light is there, but the family is staying in 1 or 2 rooms to conserve warmth. Maybe it is an office hallway after hours, with people trying to sleep under coats because going home is impossible. Maybe it is a shelter corner in Memorial Auditorium or the Donovan State Office building, where strangers are trying to look calm for one another's sake. In Buffalo that first Friday night, around 700 people stayed in the Donovan State Office building, about 200 in the Rath building, around 300 in Memorial Auditorium, and thousands more were stranded in downtown buildings and industrial plants elsewhere in the region. Those were brightly lit public places in the most technical sense, but emotionally they were still dark rooms, because everyone inside them was living by the same narrowed questions. Are we staying here all night? Is there enough food? Can anyone get through? Has someone called home? Workplaces became strange little worlds during those days. A downtown office, which on a normal Friday would empty into elevators, traffic and evening plans, turned into a holding area. A factory became a dormitory. A school or public building became a shelter not by design, but by necessity. Around 13,000 people were stranded in downtown Buffalo on that first Friday night, while about 1,700 were stuck at Bell Aerosystems in Wheatfield and around 2,500 at Harrison Radiator in Lockport. These are not just numbers. They are thousands of people staying where the storm had caught them, sleeping badly, eating whatever could be shared, and trying to create a minimum of order inside buildings that were never meant to serve as overnight communities. It is worth slowing down and imagining the ordinary details, because those are the things that stay with people long after they forget exactly which government office issued which declaration. Someone in a shelter is trying to make a bench work as a bed. Someone is using a coat as a pillow, which sounds sensible until you remember that coats are also needed for warmth and emergency trips outside. Someone in an office tower has been staring out at the same blocked street for hours and can no longer tell whether the white shape below is a parked bus or a drift around 3 cars. Someone in a factory has shared the last decent sandwich from a lunch pail and is now pretending not to care much about the next meal because everybody else looks just as uncertain. This is the indoor half of the blizzard. Less dramatic in photographs, perhaps, but more exhausting in real life. At home, the strain was different because domestic life does not stop being domestic just because the weather has turned criminal. Children still ask questions, babies still cry, elderly relatives still need help. People still need tea, coffee, soup, blankets, and some kind of plan for the next morning, even if the next morning is likely to look exactly like this one. If the family was fortunate, the house stayed warm and the pantry was decent. If not, every hour carried a little more pressure. Some homes lacked heat, some lacked food, some lacked medicine. In a region where utilities and vital services were failing, being inside did not necessarily mean being secure. It often meant being responsible for holding a household together while the outside support systems were no longer reliable. The radio would have been central to almost all of it. When roads vanish and phones are limited, radio becomes the room's most important guest. It tells you whether the roads are opening, whether they have closed again, where shelters are operating, where volunteers are moving food and medicine, and whether anyone in charge sounds as worried as they probably should. During the blizzard, Buffalo police used radio and television to ask residents to lend snowmobiles and 4-wheel drive vehicles because police mobility had been crippled. The Red Cross opened shelters, the Salvation Army moved supplies. All of that had to be communicated somehow, and in weather like this, information can feel almost as necessary as heat because it changes what people do with the next hour. There is also a particular sort of anxiety that comes with not knowing whether the people you care about are trapped comfortably, trapped dangerously, or not trapped at all. A family at home may have had food and heat, and still spent the whole night wondering about a father stuck downtown, a daughter stranded at work, or an elderly aunt who lived alone. A person in a shelter might know they were safe enough for the moment and still be miserable because they had no clear idea who was checking on the household they had left behind. That is what turns a blizzard from weather into emotional logistics. The whole city becomes a set of interrupted responsibilities. Everyone is in some kind of shelter, but not necessarily the shelter where they are needed most. And then there were the people in cars, who endured an indoor experience of the worst possible kind. A car is technically inside, but only in the most unconvincing way once the engine is uncertain, the drifts are building, and the windows are no longer showing a usable world. The National Weather Service later reported that many of the 29 deaths in western New York and southern Ontario were people found frozen in half-buried cars during the 4-day ordeal. That grim fact hangs over every calmer image of people safely indoors, because it reminds you that not everyone made it to a room, a shelter, or a heated building. Some were trapped in the kind of small cold enclosure that keeps shrinking as snow packs around it. For those who were lucky enough to be in buildings, the hardest part may have been the way time stretched. Storm nights often do that. You expect the hours to pass in a simple line, but they do not. You keep checking a clock. You listen for a plough that does not come. You think the wind sounds slightly better, and then realise it does not. You tell yourself morning will make everything clearer, but then morning arrives and the city outside still looks unusable. In Buffalo, Saturday morning brought some improvement in visibility, and ploughs went back out, but abandoned cars made progress slow. Then the storm strengthened again, and new drifting continued. That repeated pattern matters because it meant the night did not feel like a single hard interval between a bad Friday and a better Saturday. It felt like the first instalment in a longer wait. Food becomes a major character in this sort of story precisely because it is so ordinary. The American Red Cross eventually distributed about 5 tons of food at dozens of locations and fed about 50,000 people, while Salvation Army volunteers and snowmobile crews kept making runs with supplies. There was a clear reason for that scale. By the time Sunday and Monday came around, some places that had managed at first were beginning to run short. One example often noted in accounts of the blizzard is the Gow School, a residential school in South Wales, where food supplies began to dwindle by Monday, January 31st, and the school had to negotiate with the army for helicopter delivery because its trucks were immobilised. That story is not set in a city kitchen, but it captures the same basic truth. Even when people are sheltered, they're on a clock if resupply cannot reach them. The city's disrupted routines made the isolation feel even sharper. The Buffalo Courier-Express did not publish on Saturday for the first time in its 143-year history. The Buffalo Evening News printed only about 10,000 copies. Mail service in Buffalo did not resume until Wednesday, February 2nd, using 4-wheel drive trucks brought in from Rochester. These details matter not because anyone in a blizzard desperately needs the newspaper more than heat, but because they are signs that the normal rhythm of life has been broken. No paper at the door, no mail, no train, no bus, no easy ride across town. The familiar little assurances that tell people the world is still running were absent, and that absence makes every indoor room feel more cut off. It is easy, from a distance, to tell oneself that being stuck indoors in a blizzard sounds almost restful. No commute, no errands, no expectation to do anything but wait. That idea lasts exactly until you imagine what waiting is like when heat is uncertain, groceries are finite, and the weather outside is strong enough to kill people in cars and keep hospitals difficult to reach for days. Then the whole fantasy collapses, which is probably for the best. Bad weather has enough talents already. It does not need our help becoming picturesque. The Buffalo blizzard trapped people in homes, workplaces and shelters for varying lengths of time, and in many cases the hardship was not a dramatic single emergency, but a long series of smaller discomforts. Bad sleep, cold corners, stretched food, unanswered questions, and the steady drain of not knowing when normal movement would return. The phrase, "the longest night," is not really about the clock then. It is about how many things a person has to think about before sleep becomes possible. Is the heat holding? Is the child warm enough? Is the medicine enough for another day? Is that sound outside only wind? Did someone clear the vent? Will the road be open in the morning? Should we leave if it is? Can we leave if it is? Has anyone checked on the neighbours? Have they checked on us? In a city like Buffalo, where people knew winter well, those questions were not signs of inexperience. They were signs that this storm had gone beyond the usual local skill set and into something much more demanding. The winter city that was used to handling snow had become a waiting city, and waiting is its own kind of labour. Still, something else was happening inside those houses, shelters, and office buildings. People were sharing what they had. Food got portioned and passed around. Shelter space was made for strangers. Volunteers kept arriving at shelters. Snowmobile crews kept making runs. Families checked on relatives as best they could. Neighbours looked out windows for one another. The storm had cut Buffalo into separate rooms, but it had not entirely cut the city's habits of mutual care. In fact, the harder the weather made ordinary life, the more visible those habits became. The American Red Cross fed tens of thousands. Salvation Army volunteers moved supplies constantly. Snowmobile clubs delivered food, blood and medicine. These were not grand symbolic gestures. They were the practical work that kept cold kitchens from becoming empty ones, and dark rooms from becoming forgotten ones. That is where this long indoor stretch of the story starts to lean towards something steadier. Not relief yet, because the city was still buried and many people were still stranded. Not recovery yet, because roads were still blocked and the wind had not fully finished making trouble. But the pattern had changed. The blizzard had forced people inward, into all those kitchens, offices, shelters, and improvised sleeping places, and once they were there, they began doing what cities do when official systems are strained past comfort. They started filling the gaps themselves. One borrowed blanket, one shared meal, one shelter bed, one snowmobile run, one neighbourly check-in at a time, which is where Buffalo's story becomes less about being trapped and more about what people did for one another while the city waited to be dug back into view. One of the reasons the blizzard of '77 remained so deeply fixed in Buffalo's memory was that the city did not wait around to be rescued in some neat cinematic way by a single distant authority, arriving with a flawless plan and a dramatic coat. Help did come from outside, of course, and official resources mattered a great deal, but what people remember just as strongly is the way Buffalo began helping Buffalo almost immediately, in all the rough, local, practical ways that real cities do when the normal systems jam up and the weather becomes too serious for pride. The roads were blocked, the police were nearly immobile, ploughs were fighting abandoned cars and rebuilt drifts, and many people were stranded in homes, offices, shelters, factories and vehicles. Under those conditions, local response was not some admirable extra. It was the thing that kept the city stitched together, while everything else was trying very hard to pull it apart. Buffalo police asked citizens by radio and television to loan snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles because the city's own mobility had been crippled, and local snowmobile clubs and volunteers quickly became part of the response network. There is something very honest about that kind of emergency. No one has time to pretend the official equipment is enough when the official equipment is stuck. A city that has spent years assuming movement will happen through traffic lights, cruisers, ploughs, ambulances and regular routes suddenly has to admit that the people with the most useful machines may be private residents with snowmobiles in sheds and four-wheel drive trucks in driveways. Buffalo did not waste much time on the embarrassment of that realization. It used what it had. Snowmobiles were put to work answering police calls, rescuing stranded motorists, carrying food, blood and medicine, and helping medical personnel reach hospitals. Private citizens, clubs, aid groups, and local responders all became part of the same improvised circulation system because the city could no longer rely on its ordinary one. That is the thing about community during a disaster. It is rarely tidy. It does not look like a poster. It looks like borrowed equipment, quickly arranged shelter space, coffee and paper cups, shared food, somebody calling over the radio that they have one more run to make, and another person answering that they know a way through if the drift by the corner store has not come back in. It looks like a Salvation Army headquarters turning into a supply point. It looks like Red Cross workers opening shelters before the storm has even finished deciding how cruel it intends to be. It looks like snowmobile clubs doing something much more serious than they had planned when they bought the machines. And because this was Buffalo, a winter city that already understood practical weather culture better than most places, there were a lot of people who did not need a long philosophical speech about mutual aid. They needed directions, fuel, gloves, and one more pair of hands. On Friday, as the storm closed the city down, volunteers on four-wheel drive vehicles and snowmobiles delivered food for the Salvation Army from its Buffalo headquarters, at a pace later described as a few $1,000s worth every 45 minutes. The Red Cross opened 8 shelters in Erie County that same day, and snowmobile clubs provided volunteers to move food, blood and medicine through areas where ordinary vehicles could no longer pass. Snowmobiles were also used to rescue people from the Skyway and another expressway. That sequence matters, because it shows how quickly the response became local and physical. This was not a matter of issuing a statement and waiting. It was people loading vehicles and going out into the storm because somebody had to. Food, in particular, becomes a very revealing measure of community effort during a blizzard. Grand speeches are nice enough, but soup and bread travel farther in bad weather. The American Red Cross later distributed about 5 tons of food at dozens of sites and fed around 50,000 people. Later summaries of the Salvation Army response say it fed tens of thousands of people, housed 851, used around 1,000 volunteers, and had more than 400 snowmobiles involved in the effort. Even allowing for some variation in exact counts across retrospective sources, the scale is clear. This was not a handful of volunteers doing symbolic rounds for the cameras. This was a city and its surrounding region trying to keep itself fed when roads, stores, deliveries, and normal routines had all been hit at once. And it is worth pausing there, because feeding people in a buried city is more complicated than it sounds. You're not simply handing someone a sandwich under normal conditions. You're reaching homes cut off by drifts, shelters full of unexpected overnight guests, office buildings with stranded workers, factories functioning as accidental dormitories, and neighbourhoods where older residents may not have a way to get supplies at all. One address may need milk, another may need medicine, another may have enough food but no way to check on a relative, another may have children and a furnace that sounds less reliable with every passing hour. The volunteer response in Buffalo mattered because it reached across those differences. It acknowledged that the storm had trapped people in very different circumstances and that help had to move in many directions at once. There is also something deeply local in the way cities help themselves under pressure. Outsiders can bring equipment, money, manpower, and official authority, and all of that is valuable. But the first people who know which side street leads where, which neighbourhood drifts worst in a southwest wind, which road near the lake becomes useless first, and which house probably has an elderly resident alone inside are usually not outsiders. They are people from the place itself. Buffalo's response had that quality. Local knowledge mattered. Local equipment mattered. The fact that snowmobile clubs were available mattered. The fact that people were willing to lend police their own machines mattered. The city's survival in those first hard stretches depended partly on the simple truth that many of the most useful helpers already lived there. There were official forces in motion too, of course, and they became increasingly important as the scale of the disaster became clearer. Governor Hugh Carey had already decided before the full blizzard hit to use the National Guard and the New York State Department of Transportation to help with snow cleanup in Buffalo, not realizing the coming day would become the famous whiteout itself. As the disaster widened, the response widened with it. By Sunday evening, National Guardsmen were helping Buffalo Street Sanitation Department clear roads to hospitals, and before the end of the storm, more than 500 guardsmen were involved in the disaster effort. Additional military and federal personnel also joined the broader response in the days that followed. Still, even those official resources tell the same story in a different accent. They were not replacing the local response so much as joining it. A blizzard like this does not leave room for the luxury of one single clean chain of aid. It requires layering. City crews, volunteers, aid organisations, guardsmen, tow truck operators, medical workers, drivers who still have a vehicle that can move, people who know where the drifts are worst, people who can manage a radio, people who can keep food coming out of a headquarters building every 45 minutes. The storm was too broad and too mean to care which badge or logo someone wore. It simply demanded labour, and Buffalo found labour wherever it could. The city's sanitation and towing work also deserves a little more attention than it usually gets, because there is no elegant way to recover a buried city with thousands of stranded vehicles except by doing a vast amount of frustrating, repetitive work. By midnight Friday, around 2,000 cars were stranded on Main Street alone, and roughly 8,000 more on other streets in Buffalo. By Saturday morning, visibility improved enough that the city sent plows back out, but abandoned vehicles made the work far more difficult. Buffalo's Commissioner of Street Sanitation had 30 private tow trucks removing vehicles by 6 a.m, and later that day the number rose to 50. There is nothing glamorous about that image. It is just one more example of Buffalo helping Buffalo through sheer practical persistence. Somebody had to haul those cars away or nothing else was going to move. A lot of community responses like that. It is not always dramatic rescue. Sometimes it is towing. Sometimes it is clearing routes one lane at a time. Sometimes it is figuring out how to get mail into a city that has effectively been sealed off. Mail service in Buffalo did not resume until Wednesday, February 2nd, using 6 four-wheel drive trucks brought in from Rochester, the first deliveries since the previous Friday. Even that small logistical victory has the same moral shape as the more dramatic snowmobile rescues. People were looking at the frozen practical problems of daily life and saying, all right then, what can still be made to work? There is a certain Buffalo quality to that kind of stubbornness, and I do not mean that in the sentimental tourist brochure sense. I mean the plain industrial city habit of dealing with what is in front of you, because not dealing with it will only make tomorrow worse. The winter of 1976 to 77 had already been hard. January had been brutally cold. Deep snow was already on the ground and on frozen Lake Erie before the blizzard fully struck. Streets were already narrowed. People were already tired. That makes the local response more impressive, not less, because it means the city was not summoning help from a fresh, comfortable place. It was helping itself while already worn down. And then there is the shelter side of the story, which is another way a city helps itself without always advertising the fact. The Red Cross opened those 8 shelters in Erie County quickly because thousands of people had nowhere practical to go once downtown. Buildings, roads and workplaces became holding zones. Public buildings housed stranded workers, aid groups distributed food. The Salvation Army fed and housed people at significant scale. That sort of response depends not only on organisational names but on countless smaller acts. Somebody unlocking a room, somebody finding blankets, somebody managing sign-ins, somebody boiling coffee, somebody organising cots, somebody answering frightened questions with a steadier voice than they really feel. Disaster help always has a public face and a private one. The public face is the organisation. The private one is a tired volunteer trying to make a building feel less strange at 2 a.m. One reason this matters so much in Buffalo's memory is that the city did not become gentle during the blizzard. There was theft, strain, fear, and outright danger. Contemporary accounts note looting in some areas, including theft of radios and firefighters' clothing from fire trucks, and medical supplies from a stranded ambulance. Fires still broke out. Streets stayed blocked. The cold remained severe. The existence of local solidarity did not erase the uglier parts of human behaviour, but perhaps that makes the better parts stand out more clearly. When people still choose to help in a city that is cold, buried, exhausted and frightened, the help feels less sentimental and more earned. The major fire at Whitney Place and Virginia Street is a good example of this double reality. On the one hand, the conditions were almost absurdly hostile. Fire trucks had to ram through stalled vehicles. Hoses were stretched for blocks because access was so poor. Water froze, equipment failed, houses were lost. On the other hand, responders and helpers kept working anyway, with National Guard support, 4-wheel drive transport, and snowmobile use to move trapped people and medical staff. That is Buffalo helping Buffalo in perhaps its least charming form. No slogan, no tidy image, just an ugly emergency inside another ugly emergency, met by people refusing to leave it unattended. There are also smaller, quieter examples of the same spirit that do not always make the front page of history but still matter. In northern New York during the same broader blizzard event, radio staff stranded at a station kept broadcasting around the clock, taking hundreds of calls from residents in need of fuel, food, or reassurance until deputies brought them provisions by snowmobile. In Buffalo and western New York, similar patterns of improvised communication and assistance emerged wherever roads had failed and people still needed some kind of contact. The point here is not to merge every regional story into one blur, but to notice a common feature. When the infrastructure broke down, people started making substitute infrastructure out of themselves. That is a very useful way to think about what happened. During the blizzard, Buffalo's normal systems were badly compromised. Transportation was broken. Emergency mobility was limited. Supplies could not circulate easily. Many people were cut off, so the city built temporary human systems over the top of the damaged official ones. Volunteers became delivery routes. Snowmobiles became ambulances or supply vans in miniature. Public buildings became overnight shelter networks. Tow truck operators became recovery crews on a scale they could not possibly have expected when they woke up that Friday morning. Aid organisations became feeding operations for tens of thousands. The city, in effect, created a rough second version of itself out of labour and improvisation. Even the language people later used about the disaster captures that feeling. A Salvation Army official reportedly said the event was unique because it covered 9 counties and nobody could get in. That phrase says a lot. Nobody could get in. It sounds ominous because it is, but it also implies its opposite. If outside help could not get in quickly enough, then the people already inside had to become the first help. And they did. They fed, they sheltered, they hauled, they drove, they ploughed, they towed. They answered radios, they checked vehicles, they got doctors and nurses where they needed to go. They cleared hospital approaches, they made cots in public buildings, they got on snowmobiles and headed into a city that no longer really wanted to be crossed. It is tempting to smooth all that into a reassuring moral about neighbours coming together, and certainly there is truth in that. But it is more convincing and more respectful to leave some of the rough edges on. People were tired. The weather stayed dangerous. On Sunday, when a partial clearing reopened some roads, sightseers and extra drivers came into Buffalo and then got stranded when the wind increased again, reblocking routes that had just been cleared. Even recovery was messy. Community response did not make the disaster orderly, it made it survivable. That is a different thing. And survival is, in some ways, the most local thing of all. National declarations matter. Presidential emergency status matters. Federal coordination matters. All of those things became part of the blizzard of '77, including President Jimmy Carter's emergency declaration and later disaster designation, the first such federal disaster response for a snowstorm in the United States. But before the history books settled on those larger milestones, people in Buffalo were already doing the smaller work that history often stands on without fully noticing. They were already turning their own city back toward life in inches and errands and shared supplies. That may be why the phrase, "Buffalo helps Buffalo," still feels so right for this part of the story. Not because the city was uniquely noble in every second of every day, and not because suffering automatically produces virtue, which it absolutely does not, but because under the pressure of this storm the place revealed its habits. It revealed that a winter city knows things about endurance. It revealed that mutual reliance, which in ordinary times can seem invisible, becomes suddenly obvious when roads are gone and the official machinery is overwhelmed. It revealed that practical compassion is not always soft in appearance. Sometimes it arrives wearing heavy boots, carrying thermoses, driving an unpleasantly loud machine, and saying something along the lines of, "All right, who still needs picking up?" And perhaps that is the most faithful way to hold this part of the blizzard in mind. Not as a miracle that cancelled the hardship, because it did not. People still died, homes were lost, cars were buried, fear remained, the city was still trapped for days. But inside that hardship, Buffalo kept manufacturing usefulness. It kept turning local knowledge, local effort, and local stubbornness into a kind of temporary civic backbone. The storm had buried streets, blocked doors, and erased whole stretches of ordinary life. But it had not buried the city's ability to take care of its own. That ability did not make the blizzard kind. It simply made Buffalo less alone inside it, and once the hardest days began to loosen their grip, Once roads slowly reappeared and the sun finally stopped feeling like a rumour, people were left with the next difficult task, which was to reckon with what the storm had taken, what it had damaged, and what remained after all that help, all that labour and all that white silence had finally given way to the battered shape of the city underneath. When people talk about great storms, they often describe what arrived. The wind arrived, the cold arrived, the drifts arrived, the whiteout arrived. But after a storm like the blizzard of '77, the harder thing to understand is often what stayed behind once the sky stopped doing its worst. Because a blizzard does not simply come and go. It takes things in layers, and it leaves things in layers too. Some losses are easy to count. Leaves, houses, wages, equipment, cars, days of work, days of school, days when the city could not function in any normal way. Other losses are harder to pin down because they do not sit neatly in a report. Confidence disappears. Ordinary distance becomes suspect. People stop trusting a clear patch of road. A city that thought it knew winter discovers there are still versions of winter it had not yet met. By the time the sun finally came out for good on February 1st, the National Weather Service said it revealed a scene of incredible desolation across Buffalo and much of western New York. Traffic was banned for several days. In some eastern suburbs, especially Lancaster, houses were buried to the roof in places. President Jimmy Carter declared 7 western counties and 2 eastern, Lake Ontario counties, a federal disaster area, the first time a snowstorm in the United States received that kind of disaster designation. That official language matters, of course, but what it really tells you is simple. The storm had gone well beyond bad weather. It had become the kind of event that altered the normal rules by which a city expects to live. The clearest and hardest loss was human life. Historical sources vary slightly in how they break down the total across different regions, but the Buffalo National Weather Service history page says 29 people died in the ordeal, many of them found frozen in half-buried cars. Other summaries split the deaths differently by region, which is common in older disaster records, but none of those variations make the event gentler. The core truth remains the same. People died because the wind, cold, drifting snow and immobilized roads turned ordinary daily movement into a fatal gamble. Some were trapped in vehicles, some suffered heart attacks while shoveling, some died in accidents. In each case, the storm took something that had looked routine only hours earlier and made it deadly. There is something especially cruel about deaths in a blizzard because so many of them happen in places that are supposed to be ordinary forms of shelter. A car is supposed to protect you enough to get home. A short walk is supposed to remain short. A front step is supposed to lead into a house, not into a wall of packed snow. In Buffalo, many people did not lose their lives in dramatic open landscapes far from help. They died inside or near the machinery of normal life. Roads, cars, driveways, city streets, work routes, homebound plans. That is one reason the storm remained so vivid in memory. It did not only attack the unusual, it attacked the familiar. Then there were the homes. At Whitney Place and Virginia Street, the major fire during the blizzard destroyed 6 or 7 houses and left around 50 people homeless. The fire itself would have been serious under ordinary conditions. In blizzard conditions, it became a brutal example of how one disaster can stack itself inside another. Fire trucks had to ram through stalled vehicles. Hoses were stretched for blocks. Water froze. Equipment froze. Streets remained blocked for weeks afterward. So even where the storm did not bury a house completely, it could still take away the security a house is supposed to represent. A roof over your head is less comforting when the city around it has lost the ability to move normally, and less comforting still if fire arrives in the middle of all that, and the responders have to fight both flame and weather at once. The storm also took work, and with it money, which is the sort of loss history books often mention quickly, and families remember much longer. The Buffalo Area Chamber of Commerce estimated economic losses in Erie and Niagara counties at $221.49 million for the 5.5-day period beginning January 28th. with about 175,000 people losing wages totaling $36.25 million. Total damage was later placed around $300 million, and snow removal alone cost at least $20 million, with the US Army Corps of Engineers spending more than $6 million on contractors in western New York. These are large numbers, but they resolve into very ordinary pain: missed shifts, closed plants, lost hourly pay, damaged inventory, delayed deliveries, heating bills arriving anyway. A city does not need a spectacular building collapse to suffer economically. It only needs its roots, schedules and habits broken long enough for the losses to start collecting in every household ledger at once. For a place like Buffalo in the late 1970s that mattered enormously, this was not a city drifting on effortless prosperity, ready to absorb a week of stoppage with a philosophical shrug and an extra pot of soup. Many households were already living in a tighter economy, and the broader winter had come during an energy crisis severe enough that Governor Hugh Carey had already issued a fuel emergency on January 27th, curtailing natural gas for non-essential uses. Syracuse University Press notes that in western New York, hundreds of industries had their gas cut off, and 29,000 commercial businesses had supplies curtailed, while some homes in the blizzard lacked heat, food, and medicine. So the storm did not arrive as an isolated inconvenience. It landed on top of an already stressed system, and then helped itself to whatever margin of comfort remained. It took time in a way that few disasters do quite so effectively. There are storms where the damage happens in a quick burst and then the work begins. Buffalo's blizzard stretched out the damage by making recovery start, stall and start again. Mail service in the city did not resume until Wednesday, February 2nd, the first delivery since the previous Friday, and only with the help of 6 four-wheel drive trucks brought in from Rochester. The travel ban imposed by Mayor Stanley Makowski was lifted on February 3rd, then had to be put back in place that same day, after more snow and wind produced near zero visibility and shut roads again. That kind of stop-start recovery takes more than time on the calendar. It takes confidence, rhythm, and the basic trust that tomorrow will behave more sensibly than today. Buffalo did not get that reassurance right away. That is one of the quieter things the storm took, the usual sequence by which a city expects trouble to end. People want disasters to have manners. They want one terrible day, then a less terrible day, then cleanup, then stories, then perhaps a commemorative local special on television some years later. The blizzard of 77 was much ruder than that. It kept undoing progress. Roads reopened and then filled again. People thought the worst had passed and then found themselves back in whiteout. Crews cleared and the wind rebuilt. The city could not even return to the simple pleasure of being annoyed at the weather in an orderly way. The blizzard made everything conditional. It also took the city's appearance for a surprisingly long time. Equipment from places including Colorado, New York City and Toronto had to be used in the cleanup. Abandoned vehicles were towed to designated parking areas. Snow was hauled to dump sites, where in some cases it remained until early May. That detail is almost wonderfully stubborn in the way only snow can be. The storm had technically ended, and yet bits of it were still sitting around months later, like an unpleasant guest who kept insisting it was just about to leave. Even though March ran well above normal in temperature, the melt happened gradually enough that there was no major flood problem. Practical as that was, it also meant the city had to keep looking at the storm for a long time after it stopped actively happening. A blizzard also leaves behind damaged machinery, and that is not a trivial thing in a winter city. Fire trucks were ruined when water froze in engines. Hoses had to be freed with jackhammers. Streets and drains clogged with snow turned firefighting into a much more destructive process for equipment than it should ever be. Plows, tow trucks, payloaders, dump trucks, and every other useful machine had to do exhausting work in conditions that had already packed the snow almost solid. The storm was not content with burying the city. It wanted to make the tools of unburying expensive too. And then there was the smaller, but still telling damage to civic normality. The Buffalo Courier-Express did not publish on Saturday for the first time in 143 years. The Buffalo Evening News put out only about 10,000 copies. Intercity buses, Amtrak service, and commercial flights to Buffalo were halted. These may sound like side notes next to death and financial loss, but they matter because they are signs of how thoroughly the city's everyday pulse had been interrupted. When the newspaper does not appear, when the train does not run, when the mail does not come, people feel the interruption in a domestic way. The storm enters the house not only through cold and worry, but through the quiet absence of routine. The blizzard also left behind uglier traces that people do not always like to include in stories about community spirit, though they should. There was looting during the disaster and nearly 100 people were arrested. Stolen goods included cigarettes, alcohol, coffee, meat, refrigerators, clothing from fire trucks, and medical supplies from a stranded ambulance. This matters not because it somehow defines the storm, but because disasters are rarely morally tidy. They expose generosity and selfishness at the same time. Buffalo helped Buffalo, yes, but not every person responded with grace. Some saw abandoned trucks, empty streets, and broken systems as opportunities. A city under stress reveals both its decency and its failures. The blizzard of '77 did that as plainly as any event could, yet if the storm took lives, wages, homes, working roads, and a great deal of practical certainty, it also left behind something more complicated than damage. It left behind evidence of what kind of place Buffalo was when stripped of its smooth functioning surfaces. Volunteers delivered food at extraordinary speed. The Red Cross fed tens of thousands. Snowmobile clubs delivered blood, medicine, and supplies. Police borrowed civilian machines because they had to. National Guard troops joined city crews. Firefighters kept going into impossible conditions. None of that cancelled the losses, and it would be dishonest to pretend it did. But it did leave a record of the city under pressure, and that record was not one of simple collapse. It was one of strain, improvisation, and repeated acts of usefulness. Storms leave stories almost as reliably as they leave drifts. Some stories are large and public. The first federal disaster designation for a US snowstorm. 11 days of national media coverage showing roofs buried under snow. The image of an entire city effectively stopped by a storm that, in Buffalo itself, produced only about a foot of fresh snowfall, but made catastrophic use of snow already lying on the frozen surface of Lake Erie. Other stories are much smaller and more stubborn. A person sleeping on an office floor, a neighbour checking a furnace vent, a snowmobile carrying a nurse, a family making canned soup last one more meal, a driver abandoning a car and trying to remember whether the next building was 10 yards away or 50. Those are the things the storm left behind in memory, and memory has a way of outlasting cleanup equipment. There is also the question of what the storm left behind in the city's sense of itself. Before the blizzard, Buffalo was a place that knew winter and expected to handle it. After the blizzard, it was still that place, but now with an added caution. It had met a version of winter that could beat local experience, local stubbornness, and ordinary municipal systems all at once. That changes a city, not in some mystical sense, in a practical one. People remember where drifts formed, they remember which roads failed, they remember what they ran short of, they remember what kind of help actually arrived and what kind did not. A disaster becomes part of local knowledge whether anyone wants it to or not. It also leaves behind a different relationship with scale. A person who had once thought of snow in terms of shoveling, ploughing and winter boots now had to think of it in terms of buried rooftops, blocked hospitals, and roads that disappeared in half an hour. A city that had once treated weather as a seasonal challenge now had an example of weather functioning as a civic shutdown. That is not a lesson you forget simply because the sun comes out. The roads reopen eventually, yes. The mail starts again, the paper returns, cars are dug out or towed away. But the mind keeps the comparison. It keeps a little measure in reserve. This is bad, yes, but not 77. Or perhaps more uneasily, this is starting to feel a bit like 77. And maybe that is one of the most lasting things the storm left behind. A benchmark. Not a cheerful one, obviously. Nobody wants a benchmark that involves half-buried cars and emergency food runs. But communities make these markers for themselves. They measure later winters against them. They teach them to younger generations in stories that begin casually and then sharpen. They turn a year into shorthand. The blizzard of 77 stopped being merely a date and became a standard of comparison, a phrase carrying much more than a forecast ever could. What it left behind physically was enormous and messy. Piled snow, ruined equipment, blocked streets, damaged homes, lost revenue, tired workers, and a clean-up large enough to require outside equipment and weeks of effort. What it left behind emotionally was less tidy. Grief, fear, pride, annoyance, gratitude, disbelief, and the peculiar lasting discomfort of realizing that a city can be made helpless much faster than it would like to admit. Those things do not melt in March. They stay in conversation. They stay in family stories. They stay in the way older residents look at a hard winter wind and decide, quite reasonably, that they have seen enough to take it seriously. And that is where the blizzard begins to change shape from an event into a memory. The deaths are counted. The roads are cleared. The travel bans are lifted, and for a time lifted again too soon. The mail resumes. The newspapers print. The snow is hauled away and in some places sits there until May, lingering like a final insult. Life starts to move again. But a city does not go through something like that and return completely to its earlier self. The storm leaves behind a version of Buffalo that now knows what buried really means, and that knowledge does not vanish with the drifts. It settles into the place, into the stories people tell, into the warnings they give, into the way the winter of 1977 keeps showing up, years and decades later, whenever anyone tries to explain what a storm can do to a city that thought it understood snow already, which is where the blizzard stops being only something that happened and becomes something Buffalo never entirely put down. When the last of the great drifts were finally cut down, hauled away, or left to shrink at their own insulting pace, Buffalo did not return to the exact city it had been before the blizzard of 77. That is not because every building changed, or every street was rebuilt. Most disasters do not work that neatly. What changed instead was the city's memory of winter. Before the blizzard, Buffalo was a place that knew snow and expected to manage it. After the blizzard, it was still that place, but now with a harder example stored in the back of its mind. The storm had shown that a winter city could be outmatched, that roads could vanish faster than experience could compensate, that ordinary movement could fail, and that a place used to snow could still be buried deeply enough to lose its own outline for days. The National Weather Service's Buffalo office still presents the blizzard as one of the defining weather events in the region's history, noting the 37-inch snowpack already in place before January 28th. The zero visibility, the sustained 46-mile-per-hour winds with gusts to 69 at the airport, the federal disaster declaration, and the incredible desolation visible when the sky finally cleared. That is one reason people in Western New York do not usually say the blizzard of 1977 in a detached textbook way. They say the blizzard of 77, and the year does more work than a year normally should. It becomes shorthand. It means buried cars, drifted doors, stalled fire trucks, office floors turned into shelters, radios left on all night, and the unpleasant discovery that a city can still have streets on a map, while no one can really use them. Local memory turned the date into a kind of benchmark long ago. One Buffalo historical blog, drawing on local broadcasts and archives, called it the benchmark storm by which we measure all storms in Western New York, which is exactly the sort of line communities create when an event has stopped being only history and started functioning as a measuring stick. You can see that benchmark quality in official documents decades later. In a 2023 Erie County Department of Health After Action report on the December 2022 blizzard, county officials wrote that the 2022 storm surpassed the famed blizzard of 77 in duration and loss of life. The phrasing matters. They did not need to explain what the blizzard of 77 was. They treated it as a known point of comparison, the storm against which a new catastrophe would naturally be judged. The NYU Wagner executive summary prepared for Buffalo after the 2022 storm did something similar, calling the 1977 blizzard the last generational storm, with clear parallels to the modern event, and using it as historical context for recommendations about future preparedness and recovery. By then, 77 was not merely an old disaster, it was part of the city's operating vocabulary for thinking about winter risk. That is what it means, in practical terms, to say the blizzard never really left. It stayed in comparison. It stayed in warning language. It stayed in the way public officials, reporters, and ordinary residents reached for one particular year whenever they needed to say, no, this is serious. And serious in a way Buffalo already understands. Not every city has that sort of date. Some places have a flood year or a fire year. Buffalo has 77. The year sits there like a tool people still reach for when the weather starts sounding too confident about itself. It also stayed in local identity. Erie County Executive Mark Poloncarz, in his 2021 State of the County address, described Erie County as the home of the City of Good Neighbours, but it's also the home of the blizzard of 77, placing the storm alongside other defining local tragedies and tests. That is an official speech, not a piece of nostalgia, which makes the wording especially revealing. The blizzard is treated as one of the events that help shape the county's sense of itself. A hard thing that happened here, a hard thing people still know by name, and a hard thing that remains available whenever local resilience is being described. Memory, though, does not survive only in speeches. It survives in archives, family stories, and the odd objects that accumulate around a disaster once enough time has passed for people to start preserving it. The Buffalo History Museum still catalogues a blizzard of 77 travel game, a board game made to commemorate the storm in which players try to run errands and get home before the blizzard hits, then flip the board to a snowy side with new restrictions once it does. That is a strange and very local kind of afterlife for a disaster, and it tells you something important. The storm did not fade into a single solemn monument. It moved into everyday memory, even into objects that mix seriousness with the dry humour Buffalo has always seemed able to produce under weather pressure. The same thing appears in more formal public memory too. A Buffalo and Erie County Public Library monthly report from early 2025 notes that students came in to research the blizzard of 77 using microfilm and records from the era, and that a teacher checked out the library's oral history kit to record elders talking about living through it. That is the storm staying alive in exactly the way lasting local history tends to stay alive, not only in books, but in voices. The blizzard is now old enough to be taught, yet still recent enough to be remembered firsthand by many people who were there. When school children are listening to vinyl recordings, scanning old newspapers, and interviewing older residents about the blizzard, the event has clearly moved beyond weather and into inheritance. What makes that inheritance especially powerful is that the blizzard of 77 did not leave behind one single lesson. It left several, and some of them are uncomfortable. One lesson was that local experience with winter is useful but not magic. Buffalo knew snow before 1977. It still got trapped. Another was that roads, emergency vehicles, communications and shelter systems are not separate topics in a storm. They are one problem wearing different coats. If roads fail, hospitals feel farther away. If communications fail, warnings arrive too softly or too late. If people cannot stock up on food or medicine, a storm punishes them differently depending on income, age, health and neighbourhood. Those are not abstract insights added later by policy people. They were present in the blizzard itself, and later storms kept forcing the region to confront them again. That is one reason the blizzard's afterlife also includes preparedness. Erie County's 2024 Winter Preparedness Report shows how seriously local officials now treat winter weather as an ongoing public problem, rather than an occasional inconvenience. The report says the survey explored how residents prepare for blizzards and winter weather emergencies, how they receive information, and what difficulties they face afterward. Among respondents, most described themselves as only a little prepared or moderately prepared. 73% said they had taken some action to prepare, and 74% said they had bought extra food and water. The most common sources of emergency information were television, friends or family or work or school, and radio. Those details do not mention 1977 by name, yet they belong to the world 1977 helped create, a place where winter preparedness is not a niche hobby but a live public concern, and the gaps in that preparedness matter too. The same Erie County report notes that after a blizzard or winter weather emergency, many respondents struggled with clearing property and accessing prescription medications, and that disparities by age, race and preparedness level were visible in the data. The county's health equity analysis says recent severe blizzards exposed social and economic vulnerabilities that shape winter readiness. That is part of the blizzard of 77's longer shadow. The storm is remembered not only because it was large, but because it revealed how unevenly a buried city is lived. Some people are inconvenienced, some are stranded, some run short of medicine, some lose heat, some cannot get to work, some cannot afford to stock up much in advance. Those are practical differences, and modern Buffalo's winter planning has had to reckon with them more openly. There is another reason the blizzard never really left, and it has to do with how weather memories attach themselves to ordinary behaviour. They live in small habits. People buy extra food when a warning sounds worse than usual. They keep a shovel in the car. They take driving bans seriously, or at least more seriously than they otherwise might have. They pay attention when someone older says, "This is beginning to feel wrong." Later official reviews after the 2022 blizzard emphasise stronger communication, better transport coordination, more public education, and clearer emergency messaging. Those recommendations are modern, but they sit in the same line of experience. Buffalo keeps relearning winter because winter keeps insisting on refreshers, and the blizzard of 77 remains one of the major lessons already written in the margins. That does not mean the city lives in 1977 all year round, gloomily comparing every flurry to a historic disaster and refusing to buy groceries unless accompanied by a federal meteorologist. Cities are not that theatrical, and Buffalo least of all. Life moved on, roads were rebuilt, systems improved, people got older, children grew up hearing stories, and the snow that had once sat in dump sites until May finally disappeared. The city continued being itself, which includes sports arguments, neighbourhood loyalties, ordinary work days, badly timed errands, and the usual local confidence that one can still go out if one really needs to. But alongside all of that sits a sharper memory of what happens when confidence and winter have a serious falling out. That is why the blizzard of 77 remains useful to tell, not merely impressive. It is tempting to treat it as a weather spectacle from another era, all giant drifts and black and white photographs and stories about cars with only their antennas showing. And yes, it was visually astonishing. The pictures remain extraordinary. The numbers remain severe. The federal disaster status remains historically important. But the storm's real hold on Buffalo comes from the way it still explains things. It explains why later storms are compared to it. It explains why local memory and official planning keep circling back to severe winter weather. It explains why the region does not fully laugh off the combination of deep cold, strong wind, blocked roads, and holiday timing anymore. It taught all of that in one terrible lesson. There is also something very human in the fact that the storm survives most strongly, not in policy language, but in the stories people pass down. A child hears that a parent slept at work. A grandparent says the newspaper did not come and the cars on the street became lumps. Someone remembers a snowmobile run, or a shelter cot, or a furnace vent that had to be kept clear. Someone else remembers the sound of the radio or the feeling of opening a door against packed snow. None of those stories requires a chart. They survive because they are concrete. They give weather a shape people can still picture many years later. The library's oral history work is therefore not a charming add-on to the history. It is the history continuing in the form that matters most to families and places, and memory in Buffalo has a habit of being practical. Even the affectionate or humorous ways the blizzard is remembered usually keep one boot planted in real hardship. The board game in the museum is funny because errands and restrictions are so ordinary. The local phrase benchmark storm works because everybody knows benchmarks are not compliments. The official references to the blizzard of 77 in later crisis documents matter because they are not decorative. They are there to help people think more clearly about risk. Buffalo remembers the blizzard in a way that allows for storytelling, exaggeration at family tables, and the occasional grim laugh, but it never quite turns the storm into a toy. Even when memory gets playful, the edge remains. Perhaps that is the clearest sign that the blizzard never really left. A disaster truly leaves only when it can no longer influence behaviour, language, or public imagination. The blizzard of 77 still does all three. It influences behaviour through preparedness culture, and through the instinct to take certain warnings seriously. It influences language because 77 still functions as shorthand. It influences public imagination because schools, libraries, archives, officials and weather planners continue to return to it when explaining what severe winter can do here. Even newer disasters, including the 2022 blizzard, were interpreted partly through the frame of 1977, whether to compare deaths, duration, infrastructure strain, or the limits of response. So after the drifts, after the tow trucks and the payloaders and the mail finally resuming, and the snow piles slowly shrinking into ugly relics, what remained was not only damage and not only pride. What remained was a reference point. Buffalo kept the storm in its speech, in its institutions, in its archives, in its family stories, and in the basic way it now thinks about a truly bad winter day. That is why the blizzard never really left. It left the streets, yes. It left the roofs. It left the airport. It even left the dump sites eventually. But it settled somewhere else instead, somewhere much harder to clear. It settled into local memory, where it still sits whenever the forecast starts sounding too bold, whenever officials talk about resilience, whenever students pull old newspapers from microfilm, and whenever somebody in Western New York says, with just enough seriousness to quiet the room a little, that this one is beginning to remind them of 77.